This podcast is brought to you by Gridiron Heroics Media.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
Welcome one and all to the Gridiron Heroics Football Show. I'm Max Dean. You can find me on Twitter at @TheMaxDean, and today we are here to talk about some of the GMs that we wish would do things just a little bit differently, and we'll tell you how we want them to do them differently. To help me do that, I have Nick Merriam. He is our draft scout over at Sports Info Solutions, and he's going to help me with the scouting side of things while I talk about the salary cap side of things. Nick, how you doing today?
I'm doing all right. A little tired, but just grinding through things and just keeping up,
You're not the only one, man. I could not get myself out of bed this morning. I was fighting through it. Before we jump into our GM conversation, we are going to do a little bit of news tidbits with Julius Lux. He was gone for the holiday weekend, but he is back now to help us out. He's going to give us all the information from this past week. We're going to respond to it. So without further ado, let's welcome him to the show. Julius, how are you today?
You guys were talking about tired, and I was thinking same to myself. So besides that, with finals all coming through, I'm doing okay. How about you guys?
Good, man. Good. I got about an hour of sleep last night, and so I needed about 15 more minutes this morning to finish everything that I wanted to. And I was like watching the clock go by. I left my alarm on snooze, so it was just like blasting in my ear over and over, and it was not worth it at all. But I just couldn't get myself up. But man,
understandable.
So yeah, it's November. I guess it's just that time of year when the days get shorter, the nights seem longer, and we somehow don't get any more sleep. But all right, man, let's jump into it. You've got some news for us today. Got it ready to break down here. What is the first thing that you have for us to talk about?
All right, out west, Aaron Donald will miss his first game ever due to an injury. The Rams defensive tackle will not play Week 13 against the Seattle Seahawks due to an ankle injury. He only has missed 2 games in his career. We're both in the same year in 2017. One was due to a contract dispute, and another was a rest day in the final week of that year. So this is the first time Aaron Donald is sitting out with an injury.
Well, I mean, it's kind of at the point where, like, why really play him anyway? You know what I mean? There's really no saving their high pick that they're going to give away, and they're definitely not making the playoffs, and everybody else important is hurt. Even coach is getting hurt. So, man, it stinks for them. It really does stink. And they're not one of the teams that we're going to talk about today. We certainly have some opinions on them, but this year just didn't work out for them.
Yeah, I don't know if next year is going to work out for them. We'll see. They obviously still have a quarterback and some other pieces, but they kind of are one of these teams that is now going to be lacking for resources because of what they put in for the Super Bowl they got. They're going to give up a very high pick to the Detroit Lions this year. And the season is, for all intents and purposes, over. Why play them? I don't know. And the question's been thrown out there, like, why expect Donald, McVay, some of these other pieces to even come back next year, considering where they're going to be on a reloadability standpoint. And it's going to be tough for them to get new players on that roster this offseason with the current situation they're in. So tough situation in LA.
I think all you can really look at is pride. You know what I mean? Like, they're coming back for the pride to not go out like that, because it's hard to make any other argument.
Absolutely. Moving on, John Hadl, a 4-time AFL All-Star, 2-time Pro Bowl, passed away at the age of 82. He concluded his career with over 33,500 passing yards, 244 passing touchdowns, over 1,100 rushing yards, 16 rushing scores, and he was also the 1971 NFL Man of the Year.
Yeah, I don't know much about him. Obviously, a bit before our time, but that's quite a career. So that's a lot of rushing touchdowns for a quarterback who also had a substantial career as a passer too. So I guess one of the the old-timey dual threats at the position. Nick, do you know anything about Hadel?
He had a team that went to a conference championship game. I don't remember if it was the Rams or the Oilers because that's who he played for. Just kind of one of those forgotten 70s QB names. It was solid. One of the pioneers of the position really launching at that point in the game. Although the fourth pass was invented way earlier, 70s and 60s are really like when you really started seeing some evolution to like what we now call like current football. A lot more passing, and he was one of those guys. So has very much played a part in the growth of the game in the sport in the United States, and will be missed.
Absolutely. Rest in peace. Moving on, Jonathan Abram has another new team. The Seattle Seahawks have claimed the former 2019 first rounder off waivers from the Packers. Green Bay originally claimed him in early November after the Las Vegas Raiders waived him.
Well, I mean, they could certainly use a player of that style, he's kind of a very poor man's Jamal Adams at this point. He always kind of played that way, never with quite the same amount of impact, but I mean, you can see the fit, I guess, although I'm not sure how much they even wanted Jamal Adams to play like that at the end there, but far fall for him, high draft pick, now waived from two different teams. I mean, he'll always have a shot somewhere just because of that draft status, but I don't know. We'll see if he makes it through the rest of the season for them.
This has got to be his last shot to really make it somewhere. They have a specific position that's made for Jamal Adams that they can replace him in. If that's really like the one place that I ever thought he could really fit was as a specific like blitzing box safety, because he just has not been able to play as a modern defensive back in today's NFL. Which is why you didn't get a fifth-year option in Oakland or Las Vegas, and that's why he's a free agent now. And I don't know, this is getting to be crunch time for him. He's got to figure something out here, or we're going to be talking about a failed first-round pick, which already it is, but of a guy who might not even have a shot of playing long-term in the NFL.
Well, there's still guys who get chances at practice squads. You know what I mean? Who was it? Yeah, like Malik Hooker, man, he's still floating around the league here somewhere too.
He's a good player, though. Like, I know that Jonathan Abram's a good player.
Well, okay, so maybe not the same, but still, I hear you and I agree. Just too specific and a little too out of control with his play style. So hopefully he can refine it a little bit. Maybe he didn't have the best coaching situation prior to, but if the Packers, who are getting banged up all over the place, they're waving you too, that's probably not a great sign.
Yeah, getting waived twice just alone definitely speaks volumes. So hopefully you can find the trend going upwards. Moving on, James Robinson, running back for the Jets, was upset after not being active at all for last week's win versus the Bears. The Jets running back wonders how he's going to fit in with the team moving forward. So he was a healthy scratch last week and clearly upset about it after being acquired from the Jaguars.
Well, I mean, you look at the way he's played the past few weeks leading up to it, and it's like he wasn't really performing super well early in games, and it wasn't until he got a few carries and started to heat up that he would. So it's like you're kind of going for a fairly long time waiting for that to happen. You know what I mean? And obviously Zonovan Knight played quite well, or Bam Knight as they call him, in that spot, right? And so he kind of led the way for them. And so you kind of see why they put him in instead. And I think they probably stepped back and looked at it and said, look, if we're going to bench Zach Wilson and he was a high first round pick, we should probably also consider playing the better running back, even though we didn't make a trade for this other guy. We should just play the guy who's performing the best in practice. And so that had a, production on the field to match that. So I understand being a little bit frustrated. And I think the biggest reason for him is that he is a restricted free agent coming up. And so he's trying to prove his worth after being injured for a couple of years. So I think, it's probably just more about him considering his long-term future than really being frustrated at one game. He's probably trying to just push his way back onto the field any way he knows how, because the trade deadline is past at this point.
Yeah, I mean, not great for my fantasy team. Zonovan Knight was a solid running back coming out this past year. He's not a guy I had like a high grade on, but was one of the 12, 15 running backs every year who you could see contributing. Had a good final season at NC State. Not surprised to see him playing well. He had some good things, including acceleration and just speed was kind of his main thing, which fits what the Jets are looking for. Tough for James Robinson. He's really just been up and down. He's had some flashes, and just the consistency has been an issue in terms of injuries and staying on the field. And now this. So, I agree with the Jets going with their better players. If they think they have a better shot with Knight, it makes sense. Tough from Robinson's standpoint, but it's the league.
Yeah, it is what it is. And also if you follow him, he's had some issues with his knees. You know what I mean? Just soreness, which isn't surprising when he plays the way that he does, very, very physically. So, I mean, I don't know if part of their ideas that are just saving him as well for a playoff push. Honestly, I don't know. But regardless, he's not super happy about it. You can understand both perspectives on that one, but you got to play the best player.
Absolutely agree. Kyle Pitts underwent successful surgery on his knee and is officially ruled out for the remainder of the year. He suffered a torn MCL in Week 11 versus the Chicago Bears. He did struggle this season after putting up a pretty solid rookie year, finishing with 28 receptions for 356 yards and only 2 touchdowns.
Yeah, I'm not sure struggling is necessarily the right word. Struggling to get targeted maybe is more accurate, but yeah, it's a shame. But the Falcons at this point, I just can't understand why they're not just looking at. I think it's hard when you're a coaching staff to look at a division where nobody is over 500. It just feels within reach, but I don't think it's the best thing for your organization to somehow surpass the Bucks and get smoked in the first round of the playoffs. It would be just better to just see what you have in your rookie. If he wins a couple of games and he does get you to the playoffs, there's some feel good there. But otherwise, just get him some time, see what he can do, and decide what you want to do with your high first round pick next year.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone watched the Brett Coleman video about Pitts. The Falcons' offense is strange, man. I mean, it's just they're running a lot of outside zone, and they're really good at it, and they can't do a whole lot else. So whenever, like against Washington this week, they go down the field in outside zone, and then they try to change it up because they start figuring out, they go, let's run duo, and then they get blasted in the backfield because they literally can't run anything but outside zone. Mm-hmm. And then as a passing team, they don't throw the ball. They're like the only team that doesn't throw the ball more than 50% of the time or close to it. When they throw the ball, I think half of their design throws are design rollouts off play action, which is just ridiculous. Like no one's ever had that. They're playing 2 personnel that just doesn't allow them to throw the ball right now. Although they do have Kyle Pitts, and they just insist upon using him like Jonnu Smith. So I don't know. It's a whole thing.
Yeah. Yep. Well, that'll be another team that we can talk about at greater length down the line, because there's kind of this category of teams that are actually there's 2 categories. There's one where there's an opportunity for them to bounce back, and this season didn't work out for kind of specific reasons. There's also teams that have only had a couple of off seasons to build themselves up, and this will be their 3rd one. So mostly what we're going to be talking about today are GMs and front offices that have had long-term opportunities to build a team that we have issues with. But the Falcons, I hope they approach things just a little bit differently than they have up to this point, because I think they're kind of just spiraling into nowhere, But again, conversation for another week, perhaps even next week. All right, Julius, what do you have for us to close out the show?
Last piece of news for you guys. Players of the week have been announced. NFC offense goes to Jalen Hurts, becoming the first player since 1950 with 150-plus rushing yards, 150-plus passing yards, and multiple passing touchdowns in a single game, where he led the Eagles to a 40-33 victory over the Packers on Sunday night. Hurts rushed for 157 yards, setting a single-game franchise mark for rushing yards by a QB, and completed 16 of 28 passes for 153 yards. AFC offense goes to Josh Jacobs, rushing for a single-game franchise record, 229 yards on Sunday. He had a pair of rushing scores as well, added 74 yards for receiving on 6 catches. Ed Oliver for the AFC defense, posting 6 tackles, a forced fumble, including a fumble recovery, 2 tackles for loss, and 1 big sack. That was the safety on Thanksgiving Day. NFC defense goes to Brian Burns, 3 tackles, 2 sacks, a forced fumble, and a pass breakup. This marks Burns' 4th consecutive game with at least 1 sack.
Yeah, I think Josh Jacobs obviously is the standout there. I mean, he did a lot with his carry. He's got a lot of touches, but he made the most of them. Obviously, basically owned the game and closed it out too in overtime. So, I mean, I think if there's any single player who we have to point to, that would be him. Because Jalen Hurts, he played well too, but I think he kind of did his damage in the first half and then kind of held it together from there. But man, Josh Jacobs was very, very impressive.
Our ticker might be a little wrong here, but kicker Joey Sly for Washington won Special Teams Player of the Month for the NFC. Underrated thing about Washington, and this is why I don't think they're going to keep winning. Their defense is great, but the special teams has played as much of a part in them winning. They've just had like extreme upside in terms of special teams this past month, just making long field goals, forcing turnovers on punts, great kick returns, stopping teams like at the 10-yard line on kickoffs, just like things that like shouldn't happen on every single special teams play, and they've been doing that. They've now won Special Teams Player of the Month back-to-back months. So that's just something interesting. You can win games with that sometimes. This is like a rare instance of it. We'll see if it continues. I don't really know if it will.
That's all the news I got for you.
All right. Thank you so much, Julius. Appreciate you coming on to give us the rundown. We're going to get into our conversation about the GMs here in just a moment. But before that, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you and all of your work?
So go ahead and find me on Twitter, GetJuice44, GetJuice44 on Twitter. Hit that follow button, as well as gridironheroics.com. You can search my emails. I mean, my articles there, as well as on Facebook, Julius Lux.
Appreciate you, man. All right. Have fun guiding your sister around New York City and the
I will not.
The colleges.
But yeah, take care, guys. Have a good show.
Appreciate you. Talk to you again next week.
Talk to you.
All right. All right, Nick, this is the part of the show that I truly and deeply love. All right, we get to criticize GMs as if we are, the big bosses who know really what we're talking about, which we kind of do. I think we kind of do. All right. So we have 4 teams and front offices that we are going to talk about, and we are going to reflect on some of the things that they have done successfully that we like, but also there's a reason that most of them have had either very little success overall or have had an apparent ceiling on how far they can go, despite having some good things going for them. So the first one that I want to talk about today is John Robinson. So John Robinson, he has been the general manager of the Titans since 2016, came in the year after Marcus Mariota was drafted. He has had 2 different coaches. First one was Mike Mularkey. That was for 2 seasons. They did have a winning record. I believe they went 9-7 2 years in a row, but things just weren't going how they wanted to, so they brought in Mike Vrabel, and that has paid off for the most part. Mike Vrabel has gone to the playoffs the majority of his time. I think my ticker is wrong. I think it's supposed to be 3 out of 6, actually. But Mike Vrabel has been a very good head coach, and I feel like he has elevated the overall team, and their winning record is more of a reflection of his preparation and game planning and in-game decision-making than it is necessarily about the team-building job that John Robinson has done. And even if there have been some successful picks, some of the other decision-making, some of the trades, and some of the retentions or lack thereof have ultimately hurt this team in the long run. So I'm going to pull up our list of his first-round picks here. This is just a quick graphic that I was just barely able to finish. But since 2016, he has drafted Jack Conklin, Corey Davis, Adoree Jackson, Rashaan Evans, Jeffrey Simmons, Isaiah Wilson, Caleb Farley, and Traylon Burks in the first round. Certainly, there are plenty of other picks as well, but a lot of times you are judged more heavily on your first rounders. So I just wanted to at least present them visually for you. So I have some stats here on Robinson and what he's done compared to other GMs around the league. But what are your thoughts on him and what he's done so far?
So they've underperformed in terms of the draft, and they haven't really been a big free agency team at all. That's never really been their thing. I mean, they're the Titans, so it's not like players are, jumping at really want to go play in Tennessee. They're not like one of those franchises. Although they are a good team, and I think they could attract some free agents if they wanted to. It's just not. They don't have kind of that star attraction that some other teams do have. So the draft's kind of their main way of building up this roster, and they had done a pretty good job of that, I think, earlier on in Robinson's tenure. They've done a worse job lately of getting later round picks to work out. And although I, at the time, liked a lot of these first round picks, they just really haven't gotten a whole lot out of them. And this is a regime that's taken some risks, and they've taken some really high floor type prospects. Never really just in between. There's always either Jeffrey Simmons, where it's like, oh, this guy's coming off an injury. Is he even going to play this year? And if it works out, he's going to be great. But, and sometimes it does, and if Simmons is great. Or you have Caleb Farley, who just doesn't play because his injuries never caught up with him. Or Isaiah Wilson, where he had off-field issues and also just never was a part of their roster. And then you got guys like, Corey Davis, who's a really solid player. Jack Conklin, really solid player in college. But not really having that high end. And I think you kind of saw that. Conklin was a solid player for them. They decided not to pay him. Same with Corey Davis, just solid player, is not really moving the needle more than just, adding a piece at an important position where ultimately if you have those guys, you hope they're your second or third best player at those respective groups rather than having them be the best player, which both were until A.J. Brown came around. It's just, kind of frustrating from their perspective. They may have moved off of kind of those safer picks after Evans was kind of similar and tried to go a little more boom or bust with their draft picks. And we saw it again this year with Traylon Burks, who has shown flashes those last couple of weeks and I think could end up being a really good player for them still, but was a guy who had development issues and wasn't quite NFL ready coming out of college, needed a lot of refinement. There were, rumors of just being told what he was going to do on every play at Arkansas in the huddle, and not being able to learn a playbook. And I think they've done a good job with him, but this is, maybe too little too late if you're really trying to long-term build this roster out, considering these late picks. A lot of these guys are they're looking for very specific types of players. And they never take the third round outside corner who could be your long-term starter. They take the slot guy who might have some safety rotation ability, or the blocking tight end who's undersized who can take a jet sweep, or the guard who's specifically good in short yardage. It's weird. They really look for specific types of players.
They do. And I think you go back and you look at their first few draft classes, you look at 2016, 2017, 2018, they took Jack Conklin, Corey Davis, and Rashaan Evans. And also they had Adoree Jackson as a secondary first-round pick. And so he was probably more of a risk there. But other than that, their first three first-round picks are relatively safe. And even though Rashaan Evans didn't really work out, you think Alabama linebacker, there's probably a pretty good chance this guy is going to be a solid pro, right? So it didn't work out ultimately, but I think the logic was there. And then immediately the next three draft classes, they go Jeffrey Simmons, Isaiah Wilson, and Caleb Farley, who, like you said, Jeffrey Simmons was hurt and he slid in the draft. They grabbed him and he didn't play immediately, but ended up working out. Isaiah Wilson obviously didn't work out in any way, shape, or form. Probably literally never worked out. And Caleb Farley, it's unfortunate, but it's just been injury after injury. And he had enough injuries where it wasn't just an injury red flag. It's like, this guy's been hurt a lot for a player coming out and entering the league. And the expectation for him to be healthy long-term is probably more wishful thinking than reality, because as far as his talent goes, he was easily top 10 type of guy. And then, it did help that there were other talented corners in that class, but he fell for a reason, and the Titans decided to make a move on him. Traylon Burks also very physically gifted. So you see a clear change in the way that they've approached that, and I don't think it's worked out for the better for them. And so ultimately, what was a bigger issue, taking guys that are kind of safe in the first round, or not retaining those guys, simultaneously making more risky picks to try and replace them, and then not really getting the production out of them. So they not only robbed themselves of potentially replacing safe players with safe players, they also didn't retain safe players and took, the risky players as well. So that's one thing. Looking at a few stats for them. So prior to the season, so this is something that I like to do for the past couple of years. What I do is I take every GM who has been at the helm of a draft for at least 3 consecutive years, and I compile them with all of the other teams. And I do 3 because there's too many outliers if there's just one year. For example, I look at what percentage of picks you use on premium positions, what percentage of picks you use on offense. And so if you're looking at the first round, if you only have one draft pick in the first round, then it's 100%. It just throws off all the stats. So I do at least 3. And where Tennessee falls under some of these stats, they are the number 4 team among all GMs who have had at least 3 seasons in using first-round picks on premium positions, which is a positive. They're exactly 50% on offense and defense in that time. They are tied for last for quarterback. Obviously, they have not used a first-round pick for quarterback in that time at all. They are right about middle at 11th for use on offensive line. They are tied for 6th with 25% of the first-round picks going to offensive skill players. And defensive line, a little bit farther down. They've only used 1 first-round pick on a defensive lineman, so they're tied for 17th there. And defensive skill, they're up at number 5 with 37%. For this, I include linebackers as defensive skill players because I just don't really have a good way to lump them all together. But something interesting is that they actually rank 1st overall in terms of using their first 3-round picks on premium positions as well. So they are valuing those high cost positions, corners, wide receivers, defensive linemen, and tackles and quarterbacks. So they do that quite a bit. I'm trying to see here if anything else jumps out at me. They do rank 4th overall at using those top 3 picks on offensive line as well. In terms of their picks per year, that's one thing I like to look at too. They come in 16th in the overall number of picks in their draft classes per year at 7.43. So that is something that they could probably improve on statistically. They do tend to have more picks in the first 3 rounds, but trail off later because they're number 4 overall in first, second, and third round picks per year. But then they are 18th in late round picks, so that would be 4 through 7. So reflecting on that a little bit, does that give you any further insight to why they are at where they are right now?
Well, it's weird that it's not weird. It makes sense because Tannehill's been actually very solid, but they haven't spent any picks on quarterback really. And so they've kind of had to focus on building up the roster. It could be the case that this is a team that's really operated in a lot of ways the right way and just has continuously missed on guys. And it's hard to really find a pattern there other than, maybe they're not doing great character evaluations, which is a whole different story that we really don't know much about. Maybe they're not melding with the coaching staff well enough, finding guys who really fit, the plan of the offense and defense, or, the coaching staff isn't doing a good enough job of just taking the talent they're giving them and using that one way or the other. I don't know. It's really hard to say with this team because they have a lot of drafts where I've come out and I've just been like, well, it's not a bad draft. They have some players that they always pick that I'm very interested in seeing how they're going to work. And they get a lot of I don't want to say nothing, but they get a lot of guys that underperform. And to me, that seems like a issue of your front office and coaching staff not working together enough.
Well, I think there's probably some truth in that. There was clear frustration when they moved on from AJ Brown. It was
Yep.
not something that Vrabel wanted to do. My question is, Tennessee is a team that just has general budgetary restrictions. They don't go hard in free agency for a reason. A lot of times you see these teams out there, most of the teams that don't go hard in free agency, most of them are not doing it from an ideological perspective, but they're doing it from a budgetary perspective for the most part. There are a few teams that have a perfectly high budget that just don't really do it very often. And that would be the Cowboys, one of them. But for the most part, if they're not doing it, it's because it's just not really within their means, or at least they'll only do it when they feel that their back is really up against the wall, or if they feel like they're right in a window where they just want to take full advantage, right? So knowing that, as John Robinson, you've just got to make better decisions about where you're allocating your money. I mean, one of the big reasons that the general public was okay with moving on from Corey Davis was, hey, yeah, he underperformed a bit compared to his draft status, but we knew that they didn't have a really deep receiving core. But they're like, all right, well, they're going to have to pay AJ Brown basically next year. And then they go out and they spend money on Bud Dupree instead. And then Harold Landry has a really good year. So like, okay, so we got to pay for him. And then it comes time to pay AJ Brown. And it's like, okay, well, Harold Landry is a good edge rusher. But why did you go and spend money on Bud Dupree if you knew that that was going to mean that you weren't going to be able to afford AJ Brown? You know what I mean? So I know that the wide receiver market went up, but like we're talking about a couple of $1 million per year in the scheme of things. And for whatever reason, that changed their mind. I find that hard to believe. I just feel like it was poor planning on their part, an urgency to get a pass rush to go with Jeffrey Simmons when they had a homegrown guy themselves. So it's like, it's just these small misjudgments about which guys to retain versus which guys to bring in that have hurt them significantly. I mean, moving on from Jack Conklin, well, that's fine, but you better make sure that you've got a guy who can replace that production. You know what I mean? Because Taylor Lewan's been hurt. The run game is a big part of what you do. You know, we got to give them some credit. They've drafted Kevin Byard. They drafted Derrick Henry. Those guys, they drafted A.J. Brown. It's not that they have been totally inept at drafting, but they have not drafted well enough to account for the style with which they build their team, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. You can't really glean much more than that. It's just there are no, in my opinion, outside of like the Isaiah Wilson pick, there's really not many here that you're like, why would you do that? Maybe trading up for Des Fitzpatrick was like a little bit trying to force the receiver position, not taking a guy that consensus wise is like a big name in the draft circles, but they liked him enough that they did that, and he didn't make the roster. But they're not operating horrifically. It's timing. It's, logistically, like when you take these guys, where you take them, how they're going to fit. It's a difficult thing to really put into words, other than the fact that sometimes the right player for you isn't necessarily going to be in that draft class. And so you try to force a position you really need. And even if that player's good, like I hate to use RG3 as an example, like over and over again, but it doesn't matter what quarterback's in Washington, in my opinion, at that time point. Like he's not going to work out. And this isn't the same thing at all, but they just had injuries. The way they play the game is so physical. They have injuries every year. And if they have a rookie who comes in and plays great, it's just like, so what? Because if you have an injury concern or the rest of the team does, the team is limited by that. And the ceiling of this football team is they're built to be a 10-win team. Like, I don't really know how else to put that into words other than just like they haven't played to high-end football in the NFL.
Well, they're also largely counting on guys who have primarily been drafted prior to 2020,
Mhm.
which is now 3 draft
Yes.
classes ago. So
That
all of
contributes
those
to
good
injuries.
players are getting, I don't want to say older at this point, but either they're older like Derrick Henry or they've, been moved on from. So, I mean, I think that's the thing about Tennessee is it's like it's not everything that they do is wrong. It's just they've done just enough wrong to cap themselves
Yeah.
overall. And it's frustrating because you want to see a guy like Mike Vrabel have a really good team. I mean, I'm not a fan of a team in the AFC South. You are not a fan of a team in the AFC South. So it's easier to say that. I'm sure the Colts are grateful for that. I'm sure the Jags fans are grateful that they have mismanaged this a little bit, but it's frustrating because I just have so much respect for Mike Vrabel as a head coach, as a manager in game. I mean, I will forever love the moment when he gamed Bill Belichick in the playoffs. I'm trying to remember what it was where he's basically like taking on penalties to force the clock to run down offensively. I think they even changed if I remember right, they even changed the rule because of that. But that was just so savvy. I was so impressed by that and just the situation. And so that was kind of his I don't know what the right word is, but that was his breakout game as a coach because it just seems like ever since then he's been on a hot streak. He had a couple of like 9-7 seasons before that, and then he's been in double-digit wins every year since, and it just seems like he's not looking back. But I just wish that he had a little bit more complete of a team, a little bit more dominant of a trench up front and offense. You know what I mean? A more well-rounded receiver room. But it is what it is, and he's going to make do, and you never know. But it just seems like they will be forever capped until they can kind of figure out exactly what they want to do there. All right.
Well, and I just want to say really quick, the way they win games kind of warps the way you can treat this team, and I think that's why they draft the way they do. The receiver position is very important. It becomes less valuable the way they play football because they're just trying to shove the ball down your throat, quite frankly. They just want to Derrick Henry you to death. And the issue with that is when Derrick Henry gets hurt, inevitably, because running backs get hurt, then you have to become a team that throws the ball a lot. And so all of a sudden your strategy has to change. And you're not built to do that because you're trying to build yourself to be Derrick Henry.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a tough spot. It's a tough way to win the NFL.
It is, and it's also tough because it's like you kind of need a dominant defense to do that, and they have wavered back and forth between quite good and dominant, and so they need at least one of those things to be going extremely well. If you're gonna have a team where you're exclusively relying on Derrick Henry, and you just are like, if he's hurt, he's hurt, then you've got to have a dominant defense, and they haven't had a dominant. They did kind of last year. This year, I wouldn't say it's dominant. It's very good. But again, they were beat by the Bengals last week without Jamar Chase. You know what I mean? And it's like, I think you can just see where the cracks are there. So even if they go to the playoffs, if they have to face a team like the Chiefs or like the Bengals or the Bills even, it's just hard to see them matching up even with a healthy Derrick Henry at the time. So, all right. We can jump along. We spent quite a bit of time on them, and I'm fine with that because they are an interesting team. But the next one we're going to talk about is Brian Gutekunst, and he has been the Packers GM since 2018. He's had only 2 coaches to deal with. He was there for the final season of Mike McCarthy, who was fired partway through the season. I think Joe Philbin was the interim. I didn't include him there just for the sake of simplicity. And then Matt LaFleur has been there since 2019. This is the first year where they haven't been very good. Obviously, everybody knows at least 13 wins in each of the first 3 years is basically unheard of. Even the best coaches didn't have a starting streak like that. Guys like Sean Payton, guys like Belichick, they didn't have a record like that either. So impressive. But why is it that right now the team is in the state that it's in? And this is something that we talked about off air last week a little bit. And they are an interesting team because they largely operate in a way that is more reminiscent of, I would say, like 2008. Like they're kind of still drafting like Brett Favre is their quarterback. And that's the team that they want to field, that's how you win games. And things have just changed a little bit since then. And it is hard for them because they had a plan. They had a very clear plan to move on from Aaron Rodgers pre fall off. Like they wanted to get out while the getting was good. And he just played so well that they seem to have either talked themselves into it or let him talk them into it. And so, there's challenges there, but you have a lot of thoughts on exactly how they built this team over the past 6-7 years or so. And we're really going to focus on the past 5, but go ahead, and then I'll come back with some stats as well.
Yeah, so I actually have a new theory that since we last talked. So, Max and I were looking at the draft history of this team, and Max was kind of like, maybe a little more positive on the Packers. And I was trying to convince you that maybe their back end of drafts hasn't been as good. And we were going through it, and it's just like there are some decent high picks from them. And they just, like you expect to get like a 5th rounder here or there who's going to contribute. And they just don't have any. Like there's no day 3 picks that have done much of anything for this team. And day 2, like they're getting some contributions, but it's like A.J. Dillon. Like great, like you have a power back who's not even your main back. It's Christian Watson.
That was a second round pick too, wasn't
he? Yeah. Christian Watson now is like it looks like one of their better picks in like years, honestly, just from the past month. And that's because they're getting contributions early from a premium position and just haven't had that. And it's like you say, premium positions are not like a part of their plan. And they've gone defense, and that's fine. But you have to be set on the other side of the ball if that's what you're going to do. And they haven't. They've been this roster that's had, a premium tackle, a premium corner, a premium receiver, a premium quarterback, one premium player at every important position, and no depth. And it's because of the way they drafted in the back end of these drafts. They aren't hitting on these guys that can fill in those 3rd and 4th spots when they have injuries. They got Elgin Jenkins, who's like a very solid guard who can play across. He's good. Rashawn Gary's developed into a good edge rusher. That's another player. Kenny Clark at the DT position is a good player. I don't think they drafted him. I think he was a little before. But it's like, reading through these back end drafts, the contributions are Dean Lowry. Like that's like their number 2 DT for a lot of the time we've been around. Blake Martinez, who he's all right. Kyler Fackrell was a 3rd round pick. I don't know if you remember him. He was like a designated pass rusher who just never really made it in the NFL. 2 running backs in 2017. Jamal Williams and Aaron Jones have been 2 of their better picks. Nobody you would even like recognize. Maybe Maliki Dupree is that guy people would remember was a 7th round receiver who didn't do anything for them. Vince Beagle, a linebacker. Travis Adams is still in the league as a DT. Hasn't done much. Josh Jones, a safety, plays for Seattle right now. Ryan Neal took his position, back in early October, and their defense has gotten way better since that happened. Equanimeous St. Brown, that didn't work out. Marquez Valdez-Scantling, he's like one of their better picks, and he's like a maligned player in Green Bay. Like the fans kind of weren't upset to see him go away because although he was a very decent deep threat, he had drops issues, and that was well established. Jamon Moore a miss. Orton Burks was a miss in the 3rd round. Josh Jackson was a miss. They went with 2 corners at the beginning of the 2018 draft, but and they hit on one. Jair Alexander's great. That's the premium corner they have, but you're still missing other positions. You don't have a 2nd, you don't have a 3rd, you don't have a 4th. Josh Jackson never did anything for them. You wouldn't recognize that Jay Sternberger, a 3rd rounder, like that was a pretty big name that year. He didn't do anything for them. Darnell Savage has been worse these past couple of years. I really liked him coming out. They might switch positions with him. We'll see. 2 years, the Jordan Love draft, like great. You took a quarterback. Hasn't you as far as we're concerned up to now, you threw away a 1st round pick. He might end up being great, and I think there's a very good signs last week of him playing well against the Eagles, but it's just 4 years of that guy haven't done anything for you. And
that's one thing I will disagree on, because I'll talk about what I see their plan as. So I see like a specific trend of things where I have an issue with, and I think they would be better even with mediocre drafting because they do have the quarterback in place, and I think they had a plan, but there is a deviation from the plan, which I don't like, and a specific trend that I don't like. But I disagree with you on that being a wasted pick.
Okay. And I'll hurry up on this because I'm going through every draft pick, but basically it continues. They don't really have like a lot of day 3 picks that have done anything, including this year. This year's draft is like maybe my favorite draft from them in years. And they're still like just seeing some contributions from their first round linebacker. Devontae Wyatt still hasn't done much for them. Romeo Doubs has been good along with Watson. They've been solid. Zach Thomas played well. Kingsley Enagbare has done some things. But, this is what a normal draft, a good draft should look like. You should have like 5 or 6 players that have played for you and done things. They have a lot of drafts where it's like, 3 guys played all of the first 2 years. And it's like, that just can't happen. You need to be reloading with these drafts. And a weird parallel that I think I'm seeing here is amongst Shanahan coach teams. The Jets are different because I think that the front office has control of this draft. I think it's Douglas. He's doing a great job. 49ers and Packers, just comparing them. Their picks have been a lot of non-premium positions. And the Niners really haven't drafted that well. But the difference between these two teams is that the Niners have been aggressive in other ways to build their roster. They trade for Jimmy G. When they do need another quarterback, they trade up in the draft. They were aggressive doing that. They trade up for wide receiver. They, at least with the first round picks, they've been aggressive. Green Bay hasn't done that. And then in terms of free agency, like trading for D Ford, who else have they traded for? Trading away to Forrest Buckner to pick up an extra first round pick. Just doing these like extra things in terms of roster building that have been able to shape the roster the right way. They've paid a couple people in free agency, going out and getting Richard Sherman. Green Bay just had that 1 year where they tried to, get some players in free agency, Adrian Amos, Preston Smith. It's been like 4 years since that happened. Those guys are getting older now. And they don't trade. They don't trade at all. And it's just, you have to be doing everything you can to build up your roster. If you can, if your plan is going to be a certain thing in the draft that doesn't allow you to hit your high end, which clearly it hasn't been. And the Niners, I think you see like where their roster is, where it's similar. They have high end players in important positions. They lack depth, but they have more depth than Green Bay because they've been willing to add players in other ways, whereas Green Bay is missing that right now.
Yeah, I think when you look at the Packers, they had a vision. When LaFleur came in, he clearly had a conversation with Brian Gutekunst, and they were like, look, awesome. We have Aaron Rodgers. He hasn't really played super, super well before I get here, right? Before this coaching staff comes in. So let's try and maximize the roster right now to see what we can do with him. And we'll develop an exit strategy and take a quarterback when there is one we like who is available. So they did, for the first time in a long time, go after a good number of free agents, all in that 2019 season. They signed Adrian Amos on the back end. They signed Preston Smith and Zadarius Smith. And they had a tremendous run of these guys just working out more than usual, I would say, more than average for a slew of free agent signings. But so they signed those two guys, or those three guys. They were kind of that was their big splurge, and it really helped the team. Pretty much they all worked out. And Devontae Adams kind of elevated into the elite receiver that we know him as now. And he stayed pretty healthy. And they turned into a 13-win team. And then they went into 2020. And they were like, we're not going to be blinded by this short-term success. We're going to continue with our exit strategy. We're going to draft our guy. We're going to give Rodgers one more year. What they didn't bank on is how annoying Aaron Rodgers can be, and the frustration of having to deal with him and all his media nonsense over and over again. So it backfired a little bit in terms of just public perception, because a lot of people considered that a wasted pick. I did not personally, even back then, because you look at all the quarterbacks whose play has dropped off. They pretty much all are dropping off now, exactly when Aaron Rodgers' play is dropping off, just to some degree. And I'm not saying that he's not a good quarterback still, but especially with his play style, these injuries are going to be an issue. And he's probably going to keep getting them because he always just pushes the envelope just a little bit. So he's going to hit his hand on a guy's helmet. You know what I mean? He's going to take that extra hit as he's making the play outside of the pocket. And especially if you don't have a guy who's just open all day 24/7, you got to work a little harder. So I liked the pick, and I liked the idea that he was going to sit for a year. And I absolutely would have traded Aaron Rodgers. I wouldn't have let that MVP title go to my head. I would have moved on from him and just said, will take a gamble based on what we thought was the correct plan from the beginning. So they didn't stick to that. They rolled with him another year. They gave him the big contract. And I think that was a big mistake for them. I think they've locked themselves into a much, much, much more challenging situation with a depleted roster. The other thing is that when you look at their premium positions, they're actually right about ninth. So of my 22 teams, they're approximately halfway through in terms of using first round picks on premium positions, or at least what I deem to be premium positions. And that's fine. But that drops all the way to 21st when you include first, second, and third round picks. So they're not utilizing that second and third round to get premium players. In fact, to fall that far from about halfway up means that they're almost exclusively not using second and third round picks on premium players. They're using them on guards or centers or tight ends or running backs. And it's like, you are not doing yourselves any favors if you're not drafting tackles or, edge rushers or whatever the case may be. So the other thing is that they are, number one since Brian Gutekunst has been there in first round picks on defensive players. And that, of course, means they are dead last in using their first round picks on offensive players. The only offensive player they've taken in the first round is Jordan Love since he's been there. And I'm fine with being defense heavy, but I don't think that you can justifiably ignore offense entirely. And I would even argue that if they wanted to go, if they wanted to maintain this idea that receivers are not as important as everyone else seems to think they are, then you got to at least invest high picks in the offensive line. You can't simultaneously draft low and develop offensive line and draft low and develop wide receivers. You've got to get a bit more of a sure thing from some of these guys, because both can work, but if you need both, you've got to do something more aggressive. And I think they've let their talented receiver go. They've let their talented offensive lineman go, whether it be Corey Linsley or whoever else. And it just, they've got to make more notable investment there. And they basically ignored offense high and ignored premium in those other key rounds. And we're seeing their team overall hurting as a result of that. So that's my take on the Packers. I think there's a lot of things that they do wisely, but again, there's some key things that they're missing there that would have given their team probably a lot more longevity that I guess they talked themselves out of. They probably would have had some nice first round picks to invest on offense if they had traded Aaron Rodgers when, I kind of thought they should, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, we haven't even talked about like first round picks in terms of defense, just how they really fit schematically into what they do. And, obviously Jair and Rashawn Gary in this stretch of defensive players are great because they're just your natural edge and corner. But other than that, it's been like Darnell Savage has just moved around a lot. We don't know like what position he really fits best at. Some people are thinking he might transition to being an outside corner. Eric Stokes is a great slot corner. They've been playing him outside this year, and his numbers have dipped tremendously. Like, he needs to play slot. But they're not going to love to hear that because you spent a first-round pick on a slot corner. And, he might be a good slot corner, but he's not the best slot corner in the league. And although that position is getting more important, it's not, something you want to be taking with a top 30 pick. And then you got a linebacker who has been the better of their first two picks this year so far in Quay Walker, who they finally gave the green dot. He's calling the signals. That one makes a little more sense than maybe even I think Packer fans are giving credit, just because it's a position they've missed for a long time. But Devontae Wyatt has actually proven to also kind of be in a weird tweener position where they don't know if he should be playing 3-5 or 1 tech. Kind of you normally have, like, in these odd fronts, your defensive tackles will move back and forth from, like, either being covered by the tight end in a 5 position or to a 3, or they'll be your 3 or 1 depending on the alignment. And he's just been all over the place because he just hasn't produced yet. And although he was great at Georgia runs this weird defensive front that doesn't really translate a lot to the NFL. I mean, you talked about Travon Walker and how, they didn't really play edge rushers on first and second down. They played stand-up guys on third down, like Nolan Smith, and Travon Walker's playing 4-eye, and that's why he's not getting the edge rushing snaps and getting the production you'd expect from a pass rusher, because you can just defend the run in college. So that's a real strategy. In the NFL, you can't just do that. And they're not going to ask you to. Devontae Wyatt needs to pass rush on 3 downs. And it's just, you got to value things that are going to be important in the NFL rather than things that worked in college. And it seems to some extent that's kind of been missed here.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with you on that. And one of the other things that I'll point out that I like that they do, and this is one of my favorite styles of team building, or one of my favorite tools of team building in the NFL, is using multiple picks on the same position in the same draft and basically trying to play the numbers game. And they've done that a fair amount. But it just, that can't be, it's one aspect that I like, but it's not quite enough. I mean, you look in 2018, they really needed a corner. They took one in the first and second round, basically to hedge their bet there. Jair worked out. That's great. Marquez Valdez-Scantling and Equanimeous St. Brown in the 5th and 6th round back-to-back. They got their wide receiver, at least, as much as you can hope out of 5th or 6th round pick. And they took Jamon Moore in the 4th, who obviously didn't really do anything. But, when you need a guy badly, so like in 2020, they're like, okay, we need to work on the interior offensive line. So they took John Runyan, Jake Hansen, and Simon Stepaniak all in the 6th round. I don't really think any one of those guys worked out great. Runyan's fine for a 6th round pick, but it's like, I like the process there at least, but you've also got to invest better at the positions that are really going to win you football games, right?
Yeah, and oh man, I just had like a great point, and it slipped my mind what we were talking about. We were talking about multiple positions.
Yeah.
We were talking about Devontae Wyatt before that, and you did you have something else to say? Let me try and retrace my mind here.
Well, I was just going to say another idea of that is Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs in the 2nd and 4th round. But the problem is, like, you need a guy to be a contributor that'll work for you. If you need guys to, like, help elevate your team, that's asking a lot. Playing a numbers game.
You have this great quarterback, and they've just been. This is kind of like a mainstream point that things been thrown out a lot. It's like they have Aaron Rodgers, and they're like, okay, we're going to be good on offense because we have Aaron Rodgers. And this is the first year, maybe that guard thing you just talked about, which was 6th round picks. So I don't really count it. Like, I'd rather see you waste at least like a 4th round pick as well if you're going to take a bunch of guards. To take 2 receivers with day 1 and early day 3 pick, and really, make sure you hit on one here. And Doubs and Watson are both going to be contributors, and I think it worked out. But it's the first time they've really done that. They've been defense. I don't have a problem with that. It's just, it's been 5 years, and they're still drafting defense, and they're not good still. And look, I'm not like a defense doesn't matter guy, but it's a very difficult, it's the harder side of the ball to get right, because it's harder. It's not harder in that the resources are available. You can go out and get defensive players. Offense is harder to get right because you need to like keep picking quarterbacks till you find the guy. But once you have a quarterback, it's kind of, you just got to support him. And they haven't really supported their quarterback. And they've been trying to throw all these resources at defense. And this happens sometimes where if you don't hit on your picks consistently, and even if you do, you're just trying to kind of on a variant scale of like 0 to 100 percentile defense, you're trying to be 60. Like, you're going to have 4 years of defense. You're a good defense. You've seen it with the Jets. The Jets have invested tons of premium picks on defense. Washington's done this too. Great rosters. Washington, it took like 4 years to have a really good year on defense. And then they had another bad year, and then they have a good year again. The Jets, it's been a while since the defense has really fully come together. And I know they hit on a corner this year, and it's really, really, really important. But to some extent, like, other players who have been good but haven't really broken out are having their best years now. And that's just the way that side of the ball is. It's not consistent. You have to look at an 80-game threshold really to measure what a defense is. And that's why I'd expect, if you're a Jets fan, and why I expect as a Washington fan next year, like, our defenses are not going to be as good, because it's just, it's a little bit year to year, but really it's a very, very difficult position group to be good at for a stretch of more than 2 years in a row. And Green Bay is kind of trying to find that. And I don't hate it strategically, but it's just, at some point here, like, you can't be 5 years and trying to build a defense, and you still haven't had a year where it's really been a strength.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think my take on the receiver position specifically is I'm kind of okay with waiting on it a little bit, but I want offensive investment elsewhere. So
Mhm.
they just haven't done that enough. And I'm
Yeah.
also fine with spending a first round pick on a receiver. I just don't think it's as necessary as other people seem to. So one of the other analytics that I did last year before the draft is I look at who is in the top 5 and who's in the top 10 most well paid at their position. And I use that to basically dictate who are currently like the most successful long-term players at the positions. And then I look at where they're drafted and where they're available and how they came to be on the team that they are on. So are they a top 10 pick? Are they a first round pick? Are they a top 40 pick, second, third, beyond? Or were they traded for? Or were they a free agent? So basically, this is like it. The idea of this analytic was to find out if you want to maximize every asset you have, then where can you forego a position that you can find elsewhere more easily? And so receiver ended up being a place where, let's see here, of the top 10 most well paid players at their position, let's see, top 5, first round. Of the top 10 most well paid at the position, wide receivers, only 40% of those guys were first round picks, right? And then you go a little bit farther, only 40% of them were even top 40 picks. Only 60% of them were even within the top 2 rounds. And then once you get to the third round, 80% of them. And it's not a perfect analytic, but you look at some other positions, interior defensive line, 80% of the most well-paid guys are first round picks. 80% of edge rushers are first round picks. 70% of left tackles are first round picks of these most well compensated players. And you look at something like here, like 60% of the most well paid centers are free agents. 60% of the most well paid tight ends are free agents. So if you want a guy who's in some way, shape, or form measured to be a top 10 worthy type of player in compensation, he sure as heck should not be spending a first round pick, let alone a top 10 pick, on a center or a tight end or even a guard, which is a 40% in free agency, because those guys are just available elsewhere. So even if he's not quite as good as one of these free agent or as one of these first round pick guards, they're just available elsewhere. So you have to have like a dire need, you know what I mean? Which you can make an argument here or there, but generally long term is probably not the best. But that's just a roundabout way of me talking about the receiver position and why I'm okay with it. But they also have not drafted a tackle anywhere near the first round in years. They're like, we got David Bakhtiari, that's good enough for us. And then they just ignored pretty much everywhere else. They've let all their other key guys go. So I think I like the fact that they go doubling down on positions. I like the fact that they have a relatively high number of picks. They're second in the league with 9.6 picks per year in the time that Gutekunst has been there. First round picks they've had 1.4 per year, so that's basically third place. And then they drop off a little bit in premium rounds, but they are first overall in the late rounds. So they have a lot of 4th to 7th round picks. And I think that like they just believe they can get a lot out of that. And I think you just need some more investment in those higher rounds, especially the second and third round. So that's my take on the Packers. I think that they almost could have got there if they just held with their plan. And now this formula does not simultaneously work when you probably were intending to get draft assets back for Aaron Rodgers, and then you only wasted a pick on Jordan Love because you didn't actually move on to him when you probably should have. So, do you have any other thoughts on the Packers? Did you find what your talking point was there, or should we move to the next
Yeah,
one?
no, that was it with the defense. You do mention there's one more thing they've done well is that although they don't trade for players, they do trade away players to get picks. It hasn't really worked for them, but they do that. So there's something that's I'm trying to remember who the other player they got obviously Devontae Adams, which is right now not working out for them. Maybe it will eventually. They get some players for him. I'm trying to remember the year that they had Savage and and Gary, who they traded for that extra first round pick. Oh, it was a trade back with this. It was the Saints gifted them a first round pick, which that might be a good transition. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we can move on to the Saints. I had them last, but we can do the Saints
Okay.
next year.
All right.
So let's see. Let's flip over to here. Okay, so I kind of wanted to say this for last because there is just so
we want to
much to
leave
talk about
it
here.
for last. We can. I don't mind. I mean,
No, because we can do this and we can just circle back to the Cardinals after because the Cardinals just got plenty to talk about for them as well. But let me pull up my. You know what? I'll just do my spiel here. Then I'll let you talk for a minute while I pull up my stats. But Mickey Loomis, Saints general manager since 2002. This is interesting because he became GM in 2002. They brought in Sean Payton in 2006 after a few bad years with Hazlitt in the first few years. And there was such a run of success there. And Sean Payton is such a big personality that he took over a lot of the decision making, or at least became highly influential in what they did. And Mickey Loomis also, he kind of operates more as an enabler. And I say that like kind of jokingly, kind of seriously at the same time, for the head coach, who was a bit more of a personnel director as well. And you wouldn't be able to double manage GM duties for the New Orleans basketball team. This is how out of touch I am. Are they still the Pelicans? They're the Pelicans, right?
yes.
Yeah. So he's also the GM of the Pelicans. So there's no way that you can be GM of both if you're actually a full-time NFL GM because there's just too much to do. So that tells you everything right there. He's also basically the I think vice president of the entire organization as well. Should probably double check my my titles before I just throw them around. But basically, for quite a while now, Mickey Loomis has been more of a de facto salary cap maneuverer and enabler for the head coach to make decisions on personnel. And I'm sorry, Sean Payton, but honestly, you put this team in a terrible position and you fucked off. You just straight up left these guys high and dry. You went all in and you gave them very, very little opportunity. And it's tough because Dennis Allen is a guy who's like trying to play for his coach for his long-term job here, when the reality is what he needed to do was basically just take a huge L on the season and just trust the ownership to give him the opportunity to rebuild the team. I don't know if it was a misjudgment about how good the team could be, or if it was a fear that as a second-time head coach, he needed to win more urgently. And it put them in the position where they went all in a pretty risky style of team building, to say the least, and it hasn't worked out at all. So we'll talk more about it here in a minute while I pull up my analytics. But what are your thoughts on the Saints here?
So yeah, look, Loomis and company did great, really, for the first half of this regime. I mean, they won a Super Bowl. They went out and they got Drew Brees. They drafted some really good players. This is a of late thing, and we're gonna this is gonna transition probably well into the Cardinals as well, because we're gonna talk about two GMs that have been around for long periods of time in these organizations. And I think it just goes to show that it's really hard to do these jobs for really long periods of time. Like, there's just very few Bill Belichick's. There's very few Pete Carroll's. It's just hard to manage a team. And the difference is those guys are coaches, so they're kind of a little more in tune. And we talk, Sean Payton probably had a lot of his hands on all this, but we don't really know. Scouting staff was pretty involved as well. There's a lot of people involved in all this decision making. They might have made an organizational choice to become the team that trades all their picks to move up and target players in every single draft. I mean, let's like talk about the number of picks they've had since 2016. 5 picks, 8 picks, 7 picks, 5 picks, 4 picks, 6 picks, 5 picks. So they're just like averaging less than 6 picks a draft, which is just, you can't be doing that. It's just not. You have to have a draft think about the Jets.
I can tell you exactly how many picks they've had per draft. 5.83.
Okay, so I was
In
right.
Loomis's entire, well, actually, that's since 2011. I should point
Yeah.
out that even for GMs that go back, I only do 2011 onwards, just because the rookie wage scale really changed the way that you operate, and so anything before just doesn't really fit into the analytic. But so from 2011 to right now, which is why I didn't go back farther with those first round picks either, 5.83 picks per draft, dead last among all GMs who have been in their job at least 3 seasons.
Shout out my brain for just like reading off those numbers and then averaging them without actually doing the math and saying just under 6.
Yeah,
I did not expect that for myself, but
they're almost an entire pick less than the second to last place team. Kansas City only has 6.8 picks per draft, and New Orleans is almost an entire pick.
That's a lot.
Pick,
That's
like
a
an
lot.
entire pick below that.
It's not good. It's really
So,
bad.
it's
Guys, we got to do better.
an issue.
Yeah, they became a team that like targets players higher in the draft and just trades up for them every time. We haven't seen this from it. The comparison is the Rams. The difference is the Rams like targeted Jalen Ramsey, like guys who were already elite play. Matthew Stafford. And
The
Saints
difference
are,
is that they just won a Super Bowl. There is no
yeah.
difference.
Well,
There
I
really
mean,
is no difference. I mean, well, look, you're right. They targeted more established players, but they spent
that
a lot
matters.
more first round picks
That
to
matters
get
a
them.
lot. Yes, they paid a lot more, but in my opinion, the jump from a second to and a third round pick to 2 firsts, it's not as big as the jump from like a 21-year-old corner we don't know much about versus like
It still
the
lends itself
established
to
best
more
corner in football.
sustainability in the Saints, in my opinion. It's not necessarily their decision making as far as that goes, because your roster will overall stay younger, but it's the salary cap stuff it's the salary cap stuff, and then this final absolutely nonsensical trade they made with the Eagles this past year that just put the cherry on top for
Yeah.
everything. But
So they've done this a couple of times. So the Eagles pick, for those who don't know, the Saints said, hey, we have Jameis Winston. We think he's a good enough quarterback, and still have some pieces from the team that went to the divisional round and was a contender with Drew Brees, whose arm fell off and we had to, move on, or he had to retire. So we think we're still contenders. So let's try and get players now. Nothing wrong with that, right? Except for they really weren't contenders at that moment. And also their way of doing that was, let's shift our first round of picks to this year. The Eagles will shift. The Eagles have 2 first round picks in the same range as we have 1. We're going to take our 2 first round picks and we're going to swap them for your 2 first round picks. Now the Eagles have 1 this year and 1 next year, and we have 2 this year. Except for to do that, also we're going to give them 2 day 2 picks, just so they'll do it. We'll just throw in a couple top 60 picks because, who cares? We're just going to throw with the Saints. We'll just throw away picks. So they did that. 2 years ago, we were referring to the Packers pick. That was a transition to this. They said Sean Payton might have really liked Lamar Jackson, which would have made this trade potentially okay. But instead for a really good edge player, Marcus Davenport, like, don't get me wrong, like for a number 2 edge, which is what he is for them, really solid player. They say, we're going to trade up 18 spots and give our first round pick next year to get an edge player. And in a win now scenario, you can't do that. Like, I don't care how good you think Marcus Davenport is. He's worked out, as far as I'm concerned, as a draft pick. And it doesn't matter because Marcus Davenport is not overcoming that loss of high-end resources they lost for 2 years. And now in a position where you're going to talk about the salary and how it's doomed they effectively are at this point, like, they needed another player that has high-end, that isn't being paid money. And they lost that from that trade because they just they threw away a pick. And it's continuous. I mean, they traded up for Eric McCoy. I believe they traded up for Eric McCoy. I don't know if you're right about that. I believe they traded up for, they may not, they traded up for Zach Bond and Alan Trotman in the 3rd round 2 years ago. They traded back into the draft to get Tommy Stevens, he's not in the league as far as I'm concerned. Might be on the practice squad somewhere. Ian Book. They traded up in the 4th round to take Ian Book. I don't know if they thought that stunk of Sean Payton. Like, I don't know. Coaches will just like decide they like quarterbacks because of, a meeting they had with him. They're like, I like that kid. Like, he's cool, and Ian Book's not making it in the NFL as a starter. He might be a solid backup someday, but Is he still in the Saints? Let's see. Like, what do you think? You think he's still in the Saints? I'll pull it up right now.
I bet he's not on the Saints.
He's not.
this
He's on
year.
the Eagles. So yes, that answers your question. Good job, Max, figuring that out. Really difficult one. They had 2 third-round picks in the 2021 draft at the end. They got 2 comp picks for letting players go. You know what they did with those? They packaged them to go up 20 picks in the third round so they could draft Paulson Adebo. He was a solid player again, but Benjamin St. Juste went a little later in the third round. I think he's played really well for Washington. Dallas, I believe, picked some defensive players who were very solid in that third round. There's a lot of good players. The Broncos took Baron Browning at the end of the third. Just unneeded, unnecessary. The difference between like really liking Paulson Adebo and thinking he's a great player and like who you would have gotten at the end of the third round, it's not. There's not even a difference. It's the same. Like you cannot be so much more confident in the third round player you get 20 picks higher than the 2 players you will get 20 picks later. It's just ridiculous. It's mind.
They are. It is. They are at 3 picks in the first 3 rounds per year, primarily because they just often have multiple first-round picks. So that's in the lower half, which you could probably get away with that, honestly. A lot of solid teams do. But they average 2.83 picks per year in the 4th through 7th round. You are literally gifted 4 of those every single year. So they don't even average 3, which is wild. It's like they're again dead last by a significant margin. Kansas City is the only team. It's not the only team that's close, but like they're closer and they still average over 3.5. So they're just so overconfident in their drafting. And when you look at, let's see where it is. They had one of the all-time drafts, and you can't take that away from them. But it clearly just wildly colored their own confidence in what they could do. I mean, getting Marshawn Lattimore, Ryan Ramczyk, Marcus Williams, Alvin Kamara, Trey Hendrickson all in one draft, and your worst pick was Alex Anzalone, who's like a viable backup linebacker. I mean, Al-Qadim Muhammad, he's a backup or rotational guy as well. So it's like those were your worst picks, and everybody else has been like verging on, if not straight up all pro at some point in their career. It is a incredibly impressive draft. But that would be like if you can't just look at that and be like, oh, this was all us. There is a lot of luck that goes into that. You know what I mean? Like the Jets, after this draft class, they cannot be like, okay, sure thing. We know exactly how to scout players. You know what I mean? They had a class like 2020 where it didn't go well. They have to realize that they can't just turn around and draft 4 players next year and just expect them all to be superstars. So they have been very overconfident. Now, when we talk about drafting, this is the main team, I think, where we have to talk about the salary cap. And you and I had a conversation about this. Let me pull it up here. You and I had a conversation about this.
Pained by this.
I'm straight up in pain. Like, I have never seen a more. I didn't even talk about this with the Packers, but it's also like it's kind of an issue, but like we know exactly where the issue stems from. It's Aaron Rodgers, and I've talked about the decision to go in on him, which I don't think was a wise one, even retroactively. Like I mean, even like not just retroactively, I didn't love that. I kind of understood how hard it was to move on, but I felt like they should have. But the Saints, there is just so much to talk about here that has just put them in an impossible situation. There is just no way that they can get better. Like they are doomed to get worse. So if you look at 2023, the Saints are, and this has been a talking point, the Saints are currently $54.6 million over the projected cap, which means they have to cut somehow $54.5 million worth of cap space to get compliant. The issue is that they have all of these expensive players who have already had their contracts doubled down on. And I know a lot of people think the cap is a myth. The cap is not a myth. You can manipulate it a bit. You can abuse it pretty much as you want until the point where this happens to you and you have a team that is not good and you have no way to move on from players. You are infinitely more hurt by a player that you invest in that is bad than a good player that you decide not to go after, right? Like, if you don't draft a player that's quite good, ultimately that doesn't really hurt your team. What does hurt your team is if you have a player that you have to play because you invested so much in him that you can't justifiably move on, or you're so invested in him that you just can't afford to get another player to take his role. Case in point, people have talked about Michael Thomas and how he's definitely not going to be on the Saints next year. Well, let me know how that's possible when he has a $25.4 million dead money hit. So he is $25.4 million. So that means that if they release him, they only save $3 million in cap space. And that puts, or 2.8, I should say. That puts almost zero dent in their $54 million situation right there. So if you want to move on from him, you have to basically clear $51 million from other players. So when you look around and who those guys might be, it's like Cameron Jordan. Cameron Jordan has a $23.48 million dead money hit if he's moved on from. So you can only save $2.25 million with him. So if you want to move on from Michael Thomas, you absolutely got to bring Cam Jordan back. And we've seen a significant drop off in his play at this point. He's been injured for the first time in his career, really. And with aged players, you don't necessarily expect that to get better. Marshawn Lattimore, you lose cap space. Obviously, he would be a trade asset. But even if you trade him, you're still losing $6 million in cap space. Losing. So that's not viable. You can't even get assets back for him. Okay. Then you look at who else do they have that's expensive? Ryan Ramczyk. If you were to try and trade Ryan Ramczyk, you would lose $4.5 million. Okay. So you can't even get assets back from him. Andrus Peat. Let's see. If you try and cut Andrus Peat, you would save a grand total of $1.387 million. David Onyemata, you would save $0 to release him. And ultimately, most of these guys are not so good that a team would want to swoop in and trade for them at their current salary. Like, some of them are solid. David Onyemata, you trade him pre-June 1st, you still get $0. I could just go on and on and on. There is just no money to be had. So they have literally no choice but to, again, double down, restructure most of these big contracts because they have to be cap compliant, which means their team does not get any better. They can't recover any draft assets. They will have the exact same players on their team. They'll have an expensive Michael Thomas on their team. I've heard people talk about how he can basically take less money so that he can just stay on the roster and retire after June 1st. Why would he want to do that when he is set to earn about $16 million this year in 2023? Why would he do that? Like, I would go through an injured season of rehab for $16 million, wouldn't you? You know what I mean? It's like, it's too good to pass up. Like, they have no leverage over you. So, you know, they have no opportunity to get better. The Packers are in a tough situation, which they could finesse in a number of ways. Probably going to be hard for them. For the Saints, it's impossible. They cannot get any better. They just can't. So that's my spiel. That's my rant. I mean, anybody out there who wants to ask me what about this player? What about that player? I will tell you them specifically, but I promise you it's not going to help unless they just restructure and keep all these same old guys who are not winning games right now. They have no opportunity to get a better quarterback at all, period. So they're pretty much stuck with who they have. It's going to be Jameis, I guess, or...
Let's take a day 2 guy this year, but yeah.
A day 2 guy? Okay, so let's see what draft picks they have.
I think they have do they even have their second? They might not have their second round pick this year. It might be third.
All right, let's see. They have a second round pick, which is currently slated to be the 37th overall pick. So they're going to take a second round quarterback to.
I mean, I think it is a good year to be looking for day 2 QB, but doesn't mean anything really because you got to pick the right one and have a support.
You also are either going to trade what little future assets you have to move up and get the one you want, or just hope that the right one is available when you.
Well, yeah, you're gonna have to hope. You're not. I mean, if they move up again, we're gonna have a whole thing about that. We had a very interesting discussion about this. I might rephrase what I was trying to say earlier because you refuted it well. I was wondering if they're in a position where they know they're going to be so bad for the next few years. If there's any way they could take assets, you said it would cost them money, and just stink for 3 years and try to have extra assets when they come out of it so that they can at least try to push their ability to roster build down in terms of the timeline. But maybe GM wouldn't even do that because of being fired at that point. But what was say this again, because this was a whole thing that you had to refute to that.
Right. Well, I mean, it would just be basically unheard of. Yeah. It would probably tear up the locker room because guys want to win, and you're just basically saying hey guys, you know how you are prideful athletes? Yeah, we're just gonna stink, and we're just gonna intentionally stink. We're gonna intentionally tank. It would be so many issues with that, just logistically. If I was I literally just said it, Dennis Allen, I would be like, oh, you want to do that? Then I want a 10-year extension right now. You know what I mean? I want guarantees that this isn't just I'm not going to be through this and just be terrible. I'm just going to be let go as soon as we're out of this. You know what I mean? Or 75% of the way through and just take the brunt force of that. It would just be such a problem because you can't trade away players, because trading away players would require you to lose cap space or not get under the 54 million overage mark that you got to work
clarify. Out. I'm literally talking about taking picks you have now and trading them for future picks, maybe even discounting for other teams, just because.
Well, you'd be taking pennies on the dollar to do that, right?
Yeah,
but you're hurting yourself long term.
Yeah,
too.
I know, but the only thing is the players you're getting these next few years might not matter at all. It's just tough. They're not gonna be good anyways. They're not gonna be good.
Yeah, they're not gonna be good anyway. I mean, all you can hope for is that instead of giving up those picks, you just find a few guys who will be good enough for you to re-sign and be core guys in the future, because they're not going to probably make a difference to your team now, but you could probably find at least a few players who could be building blocks in the next 2 years to be long-term guys that are there. It just logistically, there's just no way that you can just actively look multiple years into the future. I mean, a lot of teams do it. A lot of teams say, we're not going to go hard in free agency. We're not going to trade up in the draft because we know that our window will open, in a year from now. But you can't say that we're not even going to try opening our window until a couple of years from now. It just doesn't work like that in the NFL. So
the other question I would have is, what happens if this team really does start losing even more than they are now? What happens if players start requesting trades? Where are you at then? Because as we discussed, they can't really do that.
The only way that you can really trade players if because the Saints actually have a leg to stand on here to be we literally can't. So if players want trades, they have to start taking major pay cuts.
Don't sign with this team.
Yeah, basically you would have if Marshawn Lattimore is I want out, then they'd be okay, if you actually want out, then you are going to take a huge pay cut. We're going to totally restructure your contract. You're going to do a whole new contract basically, and you're going to miss out on a substantial amount of money because it's the only way we can actually viably.
I wonder if there could be a lawsuit here at some point. I mean, good God, because someone could easily just be they've mismanaged the business so poorly that I'm not able to make money now.
No, because they can
Well, you're
make
still gonna
money
make
on
money.
the Saints.
Yeah.
Like he's
But
still
but
one of the
yeah.
most well-paid corners in the
I
NFL.
mean,
So
they
it's
should
like
play NFL players, but yes.
it's the only. It's just frustrating from a fan perspective if you actually understand this stuff. It's like maybe I will eat my words and they will just knock this next draft out of the park so hard that they get a quarterback in the second round and they get another, I don't know, key player, another superstar defensive tackle in the third round, and then they're just good enough and they actually compete until this whole thing kind of clears itself up. It's going to be at least one more year of being really bad, and then even though the TV money will come in after that, you still can't really take advantage of it. That's just going to finally be your relief to like move on from some of these players. So and you just, you got to really hope that Trevor Penning becomes like a star. You know what I mean? You got to hope that more guys from this class just turn out to be awesome. So, I mean, there's just so much that they have done that is just a real problem for any type of longevity. And I think you can make some kind of justification for it when you have Sean Payton and you have Drew Brees nearing the end of his career. But I just cannot fathom how you go into this offseason and being like, okay, we tried to get Deshaun Watson. I guess we'll just re-sign, Jameis Winston, who nobody else went after anyway, and be like, okay, now this is the guy that's going to, be the anchor for us to go balls to the walls again with trading assets and just knowing the cap situation that they were in. So, I mean, the fact that they spent money on Jameis Winston is insane. Like, it's crazy to me. It's really crazy. So that's enough for the Saints. I'll move on from them. I don't even want to put it all on Mickey Loomis because I know that like part of the reason they're in that situation is because Sean Payton had so much pull there. But I just think the 2022 offseason was a wild miscalculation, either whether it was just wishful thinking or overconfidence or the coach just saying like, if I don't win quickly, then I won't have a long shot at this. So I don't know, but it just clearly hasn't worked out, whatever the reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Last one we'll talk about. We are going to look at the Arizona Cardinals. So we have Steve Keim here. Let me pull up. There he is. Steve Keim has been the general manager of the Cardinals since 2013. He had a run with Bruce Arians. They came in together in 2013. They had a run of success. They actually missed the playoffs a couple of years with an over 10-win record, which it was just a very competitive NFC at the time. They went one season with Steve Wilkes, which was a disaster when Josh Rosen was a rookie quarterback, and went one and done with both, and signed Cliff Kingsbury and drafted Kyler Murray. So this is another team that just doesn't seem to self-scout very well, and they will probably have more time because every single one of them have signed a rather lucrative extension this offseason, and it's a little premature because obviously things haven't gone super well since then. But Steve Keim has drafted consistently non-premier positions. I have Hassan Reddick there as an edge player, but the reality is he wasn't even drafted as an edge player. He was drafted as an off-ball linebacker. So I think in my analytics I have that correctly, but it's listed as edge here. So, I mean, they're a team that just doesn't allocate resources very wisely. They are a team that consistently goes after older players to be core guys like that are nearing 30 or over 30. And it's worked out a little bit. I mean, it worked out when they had Carson Palmer. They went out and brought in a few older guys to go with him. And that was their most sustained run of success. Made it to the NFC Championship game back in 2015. He's actually won Pro Football Writers of America Executive of the Year at one point. I believe 2013, possibly. Or no, who? Oh no, that's right. He won Pro Football Talks GM of the Year in 2013, which is a very different award, um, different caliber of award. But yeah, Keim, I just think is a guy who's came up in scouting, and he's a scout more so than anything. And he just, he believes in guys that he likes. He doesn't consider enough of the other aspects of team building. And he's probably already had a bit too long of a run as GM of the team. Once again, I'll pull up my stats here if you want to give your opinion. Did I lose you?
No, sorry. I thought you were going to keep going. Yeah, the draft's just it's been a lot of. I don't necessarily want to compare to the Titans because I do think the Titans, like, I see the plan. This team is all over the place, man. It has been so inconsistent in how what we talked about identity on an episode, and it's just there is no semblance of a plan here with who they are picking. It is just we like this player, we like this player, we like this player, and I don't dislike that. Like, that's fine. Like, take players you like, but the consensus has never really quite been right. They've taken a lot of guys that are not like from, they don't really draft like SEC guys. So they get a lot of guys like David Collins, Tulsa, Trey McBride, Colorado State, Cameron Thomas, San Diego State, like that type of stuff. It's just like, all right, good players, Mountain West Conference, like, but not something you really want all your top picks to be. They take a guy like Isaiah Simmons on like a bad defense who doesn't really have like a known position, and probably would be a guy that, quite frankly, would be better if you dropped him in like the Patriots or Jets or Washington, like a defense that's established and can like find a role from him, instead of like making him like the best player in your defense immediately, hopefully. And he just hasn't really found his stride because it's tough when you have those positions, in my opinion, like those linebacker safety hybrids, especially, and even just linebackers or safeties, need to be guys that take advantage of other things that are good around them. You're not normally, unless it's like a true, box Mike or a true deep third free safety who have like one role that matters a lot, you're not going to see them really play amazing until you have those other pieces. And Simmons is an all over the place type, just like a what you would call like the Joker or Jack position, and just monster back, and just hasn't really. They've had him at Mike, they've had him play deep safety, he plays slot, he moves around so much, and he does some really nice things, and he does some things that don't really work, but they need him to do everything, and they don't really get to put him in one spot because the defense isn't good. They have to put him where they need him. And then they come back and they take another linebacker the next year in David Collins, another guy who just position undefined, just a lot of people want him to play edge. He's not an edge. He doesn't. His body type's edge, but it's not what he plays. So they have to play Mike, and he's not really fully worked for them at Mike yet because although he's a good run defender, he hasn't really worked as a coverage player, and they don't have other good coverage players. They need him to cover in the slot, do some things, and they've tried playing him as like a linebacker at edge, which used to be a thing more than it is now. The literally 3-4 linebacker on the outside, where he doesn't rush the passer, and just kind of stands there and plays linebacker. And like, he's been better, but it's just not a position that works in today's NFL. So like, what are we doing there? It sucks because my favorite prospect ever, if you've ever followed me on Twitter, is Rondale Moore. I love Rondale Moore. Fantastic football player. And I think he's been great for them this year. And they have a good receiving core, but they haven't fully built anything position. Like, they don't have a position group that you really feel good about outside of maybe those receivers. And the difference between that group and all their others is they decided they were going to be good at receiver, and they threw so many resources at that position group. That's the one plan you've seen from them is we have a quarterback and we want him to throw the ball deep. All right, here's DeAndre Hopkins trade. Here's Marquise Brown trade, which they overpaid for. Here's a drafting of Rondale Moore. Here's trading for Andy Isabella. Here's Here's paying AJ Green, which was okay last year and really hasn't done a whole lot since. Here's who else they had. Here's trading for Robbie Anderson. Like, eventually you're gonna have a pretty good receiving core, and they do. And they drafted tight end Trey McBride. They really, really went after this pass catching unit, and to some extent, like, it's good, but it's not excellent. It's not the best receiving core in the league, and all these other position groups, there's a lack of a plan. They're all over the place. They took 2 outside linebacker edge types this year. One's bigger, one's smaller. They don't really work precisely together. JJ Watt is like in the 3-4 scheme in his career, but he's just playing like 3 tech for them now, and they don't really move him around a whole lot. I don't know. They really, really invested on that D line, and it hasn't turned into much. Secondary, they haven't really invested at all outside of Byron Murphy. Isaiah Simmons is supposed to be a safety and isn't. Buda Baker is good, but alone, that guy doesn't make your secondary. Offensive line, they haven't really invested. It's been a lot of front seven and weapons, and they haven't got either position group right, so they just kept investing there. And because of that, the secondary and the offensive line have continued to just be either below average or bad for the last 4 years.
Well, they are second to last of all GMs who have been in the position for at least 3 years in using premium picks on premium positions. Or I should say first round picks specifically. The only team that has used less first round picks on premium positions is the Indianapolis Colts. And there's definitely an argument to be made for them to be in this conversation as well, but we're not including them at the moment. But I mean, you only have so many first round picks, and you've used 1 on a guard, 1 on a safety, 3 on off ball linebackers. You know what I mean? Like,
And like a
in
box safety.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And they spent that first round pick on Dylan Buchanan after coming off of drafting Tyrann Mathieu in like the 3rd round the year before that, I think it was. I'm pretty sure he was
Second
a
round,
third 20. I think he was a 3rd round pick.
I think he went like 37th or something like that.
Check it out. But anyway, regardless, he played really well as a rookie, and then they went out and spent a first round pick on Dylan Buchanan.
Oh, you're right. That was a round early, 69th. Pull 32 picks off.
And Jonathan Cooper was basically a complete bust. Dylan Buchanan was not that great. I mean, your best player from 2013 to 2022, because they didn't have a first round pick this year, your best drafted first round pick in essentially a full decade of being GM is who? Is it Kyler Murray or is it DJ Humphries?
I mean, it's Kyler Murray, but it's a layup.
And then, yeah, I mean, it's a layup first overall, and there's major questions about you know what I mean, him at this point in terms of his leadership ability, which again is quite important when you're talking about quarterback. It's not just how well you can play. Hassan Reddick was probably their second best player that they drafted, except they didn't figure out how to use him until
too late.
His fourth or fifth year with the team, and then he's gone and been better everywhere else, because he's been more well used. Again, it's a lack of a plan. It's a lack of a big picture utilization of resources. The roster is not young, and certainly the most key players that are participating right now are not young, and there's no reason that they're going to get better dramatically next year. So aside from Kyler Murray just, running all over the field and slinging the ball all over and getting very lucky from time to time with, a monster play down the field, it just doesn't seem like there's anything sustainable about what they're doing here.
Yeah, and I actually, obviously Kyler has some off-field concerns that we're not certain of at this point. In seeing all this, I actually think I still believe in Kyler. I think he's maybe been a little bit thrown under the bus by some people because he kind of didn't take a normal path to the NFL, and you make enemies by doing that because everyone wants you to kind of suck up and get a QB coach and do all the draft processy stuff. And he was a baseball player who decided he was going to play football. And I'm going to be honest with you, like a lot of off-season work people like get annoyed that people can do that. They just think about it. Like you're hosting a football game for players who are going into the draft, from college as an all-star game, or you're, a scout or an agent who makes a lot of your money in the off season. And this guy just decides he's going to play football. and doesn't do any of the off-season stuff that normally makes you money. He just says, "No, I don't need to do that," and then plays well. Like some people, I think, are a little upset by that, and still are upset about it. But that's a whole other discussion. Anyways, Cliff Kingsbury, I think he's done. Like, I don't think it's working out. I think that was a hire by Kine that they got him because he liked Kyler, and it didn't work out. And that's a really like it could have. I'm gonna be honest with you. Like a lot of people don't like Cliff and have not liked him from the get go. I understood it because I think you get a guy who wants to work with a quarterback you think is worth that pick. I think he's shown he's talent wise worth that pick, and you had a guy who wanted it and just hasn't worked. And I think you needed to move off of it a little earlier than you did. And the process was, in my opinion, fine. Like you missed on a QB the year before you traded up for, and you said, "All right, fine, we're going to get some picks for him." You did. You got some good picks for him. We're going to get this other quarterback. That was like the best thing they've done, in my opinion. It's just then how do you surround him? And yes, the receiving core has been built up, but DJ Humphries is their only real investment in offensive line. They signed Will Hernandez and Justin Pugh and like some veterans who've been decent, traded for Rodney Hudson. They've tried to build up that interior. And the one time last year where it was a decent interior, like they had a really good run game, and that was a part of them starting out as well as they did. But then they had injuries, and it just didn't stick around, and they don't have any depth because they haven't invested late picks at guard until literally this year, where they have like Leketta Smith playing guard because they need him to. It's so inconsistent in what they're building because yes, they want to drop back and run forwards every play if they can. Like we have all these speedsters, and we're just going to do it. And ideally, if you're so good at receiver and quarterback, you can overcome offensive line with that. But they're not. They don't have Patrick Mahomes and 4 Tyreek Hills, so they're not going to do that. They need to get somewhat better the O-line. They've been horrific there, really. And then defensively, it's just the value of the linebacker position is just wild to me. Like we have got to move past some of these teams. Like it is, yes, it's a position that you can get gashed by if you don't have bodies there. But there are so many guys every year who are reasonable run stoppers at that position who you can get on later picks. And this is a team that really hasn't drafted the linebacker position anywhere but in the first round. They've taken effectively, I'm going to call Buchanan and Reddick linebackers because that's where they used them, 4 linebackers in the first round. And you could argue they have not hit on a single one.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think you're wrong at all because Son Reddick, again, at that position where they drafted him and attempted to use him, it didn't work. Mm-hmm. It just straight up didn't work. And, just because he's good at doing something else that they didn't realize doesn't mean that it was a hit of a pick. And so the majority of the picks have been missed. I mean, Josh Rosen, that's definitely one of the worst quarterback picks in recent memory.
I don't really blame them for that because he was like a well-liked prospect, and a lot of people thought he was going to be good. It just didn't work out. That happens, and they adjusted to that well. There's some good things here, in my opinion. Like Christian Kirk, like they're gonna get more out of him than you would have ever expected. Like had a kind of meh first 3 years, really broke out year 4, didn't pay him. They're getting a 3rd round comp pick for Christian Kirk. Like that's great. Like fantastic. The Ravens like make a roster off of this stuff. Just getting good 4th years out of guys and turning those into comp picks. It's just, I have no faith that
that's not their strategy, though.
No, it's not.
It just happened. I mean, they make an average of 2.9 picks in the first 3 rounds per year. That puts them tied for 20th, so second to last place of all of those top 22 teams. So, I mean, they have less than 1 pick in the first 3 rounds each every single year. Throw in the fact that, so that's already low. Throw in the fact that they're making all of these picks at overall non-valuable positions. It's just like, where are you getting value from? Your 33-year-old J.J. Watts, your DeAndre Hopkins, who's, basically signing his 3rd contract when you trade for him. Great, but there's just no longevity there. There's no sustainability there. Who else is a key player for you right now? Marquise Brown, like you traded for him, and that's great, but like, you're going to have to pay him. And he had a good year, actually. So, I mean, I suppose that's probably not something to necessarily harp on too much. But again, just looking at his career so far, I do find it kind of hard to believe that that's going to be sustainable as well. So there's just like nothing to hang your hat on. No identity, no long-term plan, no highly youthful roster, no schematic advantage, no high number of draft picks, you know what I mean? Just so that you're playing the numbers game. There's like what are we looking at here?
It feels like they're taking players because they have to.
Who says they have to take Zaven Collins? I don't think anybody.
No, but like if it's almost like they don't. I don't want to say like they don't care, but it's just like there's no the plan is, here's a guy we like. Oh, he's available. Sure, we'll take him, I guess. Like that's the plan at this point, in my opinion. And the problem with something like that is normally, we'd be fine with. Again, I'm repeating myself with this. Like, take the player, the best player available in your opinion. But it's just they're all over the place. Like, it is tough. Like, this is a tough one because they have gotten no contributions from their late round picks. Their early picks aren't bad, but there's no home runs. There's just like Zach Allen, decent player. Byron Murphy, decent player. This year, I think Trey McBride, Cam Thomas, Myjai Sanders all look like decent players. Christian Kirk, decent player. Budda Baker, good player, probably their best draft pick, but he's a safety. Like, he can only do so much. None of these guys, consensus-wise, are steals, in my opinion. Maybe Josh Jones that one year was thought of a steal, but he hasn't worked out at all. They're not on a consensus. They're not drafting a specific type of player. It's the reason I say it just feels like they're taking players because they have to is it's almost like if they didn't have these draft picks, they wouldn't like really be hurt that much. Like, they're just like, we have to go draft some players. So I guess we like this guy a little bit. Sure. It's uninspired. There's no
I think
it's just
when you look at it, it's like a lot of guys are special athletes in some way, shape, or form. And the scouting staff seems to be operating primarily off of that. There's no real input from the coaching staff. Like, this is the skill set we need. This is the kind of player we need. Or these are a few of the players that would be really beneficial for our offense or defense. It's like there is a division between the coaching staff and the scouting staff and front office. And one is operating with zero input from the other.
Like, I guess there's a kind of like a 3-year stretch where they do go for athletes with Murphy, Murray, Simmons, Collins, and Moore. But really, like, look at this draft here, 2019. So you take Kyler Murray, who's your Heisman quarterback. Right. That's number one pick.
But he's a super athlete.
Byron Murphy, great athlete. People liked him. That was kind of thought of as some PFF had him as a top 10 player. Like, people really liked Byron Murphy coming out. That makes sense. Pac-12 corner, Washington produces those guys. All right, speedster Andy Isabella, which has been a thing. Like, it's the one consistency they have is they love just straight line speed receivers, which is like great, like everyone does. And you apparently only like that type of receiver. Then we go with like Northeast, gritty Zach Allen, who produced like one really nice year at Boston College and was like a hybrid player, and has turned into like a nice player for them. Then Hakeem Butler, who had like freaky tape but was not a good athlete, didn't have great stats because Iowa State doesn't throw the ball. Like, no production, no athleticism, just like a tape guy. Had to become a tight end, is still in the league as a tight end, but kind of bouncing around, not really still in the league. Then Deontay Thompson, who was a high prospect out of high school, never really fully became like a great player at Alabama, but had all this potential. Like, this was a high school potential pick, and they took him. Then Keyshawn Johnson, who was more of a tester and like a lesser known like tape guy who was like pretty good, and then had a good preseason, and they just never used him. I don't remember Lamont Gaylord or Josh Miles and Michael Dogby. Caleb Wilson, then another guy, like high-end, like high school prospect who just never really made it at UCLA, and they decided to spend. They're the background of player they look for. Like some teams really like those high school prospects who just never really make it in the NFL. Some teams really like injured players, like the Titans, who like have all this potential but just have been injured. Some teams really like guys with backgrounds of like military personality who are like going to go to work for you and be great. Like Washington does this. Some teams just use the consensus. I think the Jets do this. Like they take the players who are likely to get picked in that spot. If a guy is available who most teams have higher on their boards, you just take him regardless of the position, just best player available. The Cardinals have no type. They don't have a type of player. They just take players. It's like they're rolling a dice, and they're just like, oh, okay, landing on 12. Who's our 12? We're taking this guy. Like there's nothing here to go off of. I can't sum this up for you. I can't. Like there's nothing.
Well, I think a lot of times type is heavily influenced by the coaching staff.
Yeah.
Because they're like, this is a skill set we want, and this is the type of player that we want because I know how to coach this kind of player, this kind of person. And I just don't think that there's any consistent input from the coaching staff, because just when you look at what they draft versus what they use and what they run and what they need is not there. I mean, like, I find it hard to believe that a defensive coaching staff is not like, okay, well, we kind of desperately need edge rushers right now. You know what I mean? Like, is no one saying that? Because yeah, they drafted 2 in the 3rd round this year, like a speed guy and a big guy. But that's
neither NFL ready. Both like power, not group of 5 guys, like not power 5.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, but that's this year. That's 2022, and that's supposed to take over for. I don't know. It makes no sense. Nothing about this makes any sense. The offensive line is just it's really has very little investment. It seems like everything that they need, they try to address in free agency with but not like middle tier free agency with 20-something guys who are, coming off of decent years. It's like these guys who are 30 plus and just, almost assuredly never going to produce like they once did, but still getting $10 million plus contracts. Like JJ Watt's been playing okay, but again, he's missed how much time for them due to injury? And it's like, what made you think that signing him for $14 million per year or something like that was a good call? Just he missed so much time with the Texans in the last few years. Just didn't make any sense. But
yeah, I mean, and again, like,
sorry, Cardinals fans. I mean, yeah. I doubt any of you have sat through that, because either you are like along for the ride with venting, or
our friend Donnie would be with us on this. I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot here to be frustrated with. We were taken aback by the Marquise Brown trade. Like it's blindsiding, because I think for a while people really did want them to keep adding speed receivers, and they just kept doing it and it wasn't working. And normally when something doesn't work, you move off of it, right? It's like the definition of insanity is stop trying the same thing over and over again. And they just, not only do they keep doing it, but I think they kind of hit on Marquise Brown. And then they said, oh yeah, we're also going to go get Robbie Anderson. Like they don't stop. That's the identity is literally just, we want fast receivers. And we don't care how many we have or if they're good. And we just want to get, like, they want to corner the market on them, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if that's they even get anything out of that in the NFL. Probably not. So I don't know what their plan is.
There's just not enough everywhere else. There's just not enough. I mean, you cannot, if you are up, you can't just keep throwing the ball. You know what I mean? Because if you're not like a precision passing game, then you are inevitably going to just have 3 and outs. You know what I mean? And yeah, like you might score, but if you go up against a team who can stop that, then it's like you don't give yourself any other pathway to success. It's just, I'm done with the Cardinals. I'm moving on. Last thing we're going to talk about, we don't have to spend a ton of time on it, is Thursday Night Football tonight. The Buffalo Bills are going into the New England Patriots, and they are currently 3.5-point favorites. Bills have been banged up. They've lost a couple of games where they probably should have won when you look at the actual matchup. They're still currently tied for the lead within the division, which they don't have the tiebreaker for, but they're right there. They could certainly still win. They are 100% undoubtedly more talented than the New England Patriots. Short week going into New England, you always give a little bit of credit to the Patriots there, but you know, I have a hard time believing that the Bills don't walk out of here with a victory. I shouldn't be surprised if it happens because Belichick has just proven himself, countless times over the course of his career. But if you look at the matchups between these two teams lately, if there's not some wild windstorm, this should be like a pretty resounding victory for the Buffalo Bills. So we don't have to spend a ton of time on this game, but it is a divisional matchup. There's two teams that are either in the playoff race or just outside of it at the moment. What are your thoughts on the Patriots and Bills and the perspective for each of these teams both now and as the season progresses?
Well, we don't have a windy matchup this time, so that's going to be something that New England cannot, base themselves off of. It's going to have to look up something similar, I think, if they want to win, though, because we don't know what type of Mac Jones we're getting. The one we saw on Thanksgiving was very good. I don't know if maybe that guy is coming back a little bit. If he is, they have a shot to score a little bit here, I think. Bill's defense has shown an ability to, fold on third downs at times, and you can push them if you really stay balanced. New England obviously can run the ball well. They'll take advantage in some ways. But, Buffalo always has the ace up their sleeve of all these edge rushers they have. Even with Von Miller injured, they still have some guys who can get after the quarterback. I would expect that is going to be a struggle for New England as well as the other side of the ball because you're dealing with Josh Allen. And although New England does like a lot of really unique, creative things week to week, Bill Belichick just one of the best defensive game planners in the NFL over the past 20 years. And I would expect them to do something at some point to fool Josh Allen. Didn't happen in the playoff game 2 years ago. What am I talking about? Last year, literally closer to a half a year ago. I don't know where that came from. 2 years. Jeez. But the Bills are going to have to lean on Allen. That's what it's been. Like they don't have the offensive line to fully just gash you in the run game, and New England's going to be disciplined enough to not allow that. The question I think has been for Buffalo these past few weeks is we're seeing kind of a regression to the early year Josh Allen last year, where his accuracy dips a little bit in the short to intermediate areas. There's more turnovers, decision-making dips because he's starting to try to force balls a little bit because he's frustrated. They need him to get back to kind of the late year last year, earlier this year form. We've seen this oscillation back and forth from those two types of Josh Allen. It's why I'd still take Patrick Mahomes as the best quarterback in the NFL at this point in time over a longer, if we're trying to build a roster, I think he long-term is a better player. But Allen's high end is still the best of any player in the NFL. And at any point, he could flip that switch back on. And I don't think these teams are close when that happens. But if we get the Josh Allen from Minnesota, the Josh Allen from Miami this year, this is a very winnable game for New England because, as we've seen, this defense has multiple players who are capable of making game-changing turnovers and flipping this game on its head.
Yeah, I do believe that they have Jordan Poyer back for this game, so he should be active. Greg Rousseau is questionable. I think that he is playing, and so that's going to be big for them. Ed Oliver has been having a very good year. That's going to be tough for the Patriots to deal with as well. And again, Tremaine Edmonds is also an important player in their run defense too. So, I mean, I can definitely see a pathway for the Patriots, hypothetically, where they're able to run the ball. Bills have had issues with that periodically. I think, not having both of their safeties for the majority of the season has hurt them in that regard. The style of defense they play requires like very effective safety play in the run game because you're coming from depth a lot of the time. So it's like you've got to really be on point with that. I think if they are able to run the ball effectively, they do have a good defense, and it would just take a couple of turnovers to make it a very interesting game for New England. But at the same time, Isaiah Wynn is out. They're playing Trent Brown at left tackle at this point. Their offensive line is good in the run game, but it's not necessarily very good at stopping the pass rush. And even though Mac Jones hasn't really been turning the ball over as much, he's still been taking a lot of sacks. You know what I mean? And those are major negative plays, even if they're not turnovers. So I think that was definitely a plausible outcome for them, because if they can't run the ball and they have to throw, like, that will definitely rear its head. I'm Josh Allen is really the major question in this game, because if he's just hot, it's over. Like, it
Yeah.
is what it is. There's really no question about it. If he's hitting Stephon Diggs all over the place and they have a monster game together, everything else is really secondary, and they will win this game just because of that. If Josh Allen is pressing, if he's throwing interceptions that we don't really understand, then he will inevitably keep New England in this game, and that's like the exact kind of pathway for them to win any game that they play against a superior a team with superior talent, which the Bills certainly are.
Yeah. If we're talking about just picking this game in general, like I do think the Bills are going to win, because I just think player to player, I think they're more talented than New England. But if I were to guess, I think Josh Allen's still kind of in this rut, and I think it's going to continue a little longer. I think he'll get it going before the postseason starts, and we'll really see those Bills again, who were Super Bowl. It might still be Super Bowl favorites. I think they actually are, at least in terms of the betting markets, in terms of lines and spreads. They're still power ranked as the best team. But this spread, in my opinion, of 3.5, I think is a pretty reasonable play for New England if you're going to bet this game and you feel good about it. Just because you're across that key number of 3, they're at home. I think that it's very possible this could end up being kind of a grindy, defensive, low-scoring game, like we've seen from the past of the Bills and these A's. Literally, both games they played against the Dolphins and Jets, I think we see a similar type of football game.
So, because the AFC East is such an interesting division, it's one of the few teams, or one of the few divisions, where every single team is over 500 at this point in the season, which is pretty unusual even in general.
Yeah.
But what do you think about that division as a whole? I mean, currently the Miami Dolphins look incredibly hot offensively. Losing Terron Armstead last week was like an instantaneous difference in their offensive output. They had enough of a lead, but it almost felt like they were letting the Texans back in the game just with the loss of one player.
Yeah. I mean, they had to take Tua. I had to do that game for Sports Info Solutions. I did the defense. They had to take Tua out because both teams decided to keep throwing, even though it was a 30-0 game. And quarterbacks were getting massacred because they could not block Jerry Hughes or Ogbonnia Okoronkwo, which is wild. That's a thing happening. But for a team that's as good as Miami is, as long as Armstead's healthy, I really like the Dolphins. I think they're a Super Bowl contender. The moment he isn't, though, again, we've talked about this before, I think they're kind of fragile. Like, I think they really fall apart with that injury. And you saw that against a team that's not known for being good as a pass rushing team, really giving them problems. Really good at anything in Houston. I still think this is the best division of football. The NFC East gets all the hype. Like, I think the Commanders are fun, decent football team who, is going to be plucky. I don't think they're that great. They're probably been a little lucky to get to this point. I think the Giants, quite frankly, at this point are kind of showing you that what they were at the beginning of the season is probably a below average football team, quite frankly. Dallas and Philly are really good. I don't know that they're like better than the Bills and Dolphins at their biggest strength as a pair. But both those 4 teams are very good. I just think the Jets and Patriots are more established than Washington and the Giants are. And a big reason for that is defensive consistency. I think both those teams play good defense. And I think the Jets have a plan on offense that produces yardage, and New England has a run game that at least somebody, like, if you look at EPA per play, the Jets, Patriots, and Washington are like the exact same teams. They're all the same in terms of offensive output, defensive output. They're all very good on defense, and they're below average on offense slightly. All like to run the ball. The Jets have now this kind of card up their sleeve of we've changed at quarterback and looked better after 1 week. If it continues, like, this is a football team that's going to move on the right direction on that x-axis of being better. I guess it's this way for you guys on the offensive side of the ball. And New England just has the more the basis of being the Patriots and not, they're never going to fall off. The bottom's not going to fall out. Whereas Washington, I can see having that happen. And the Giants are kind of on the opposite side where they've been better on offense and worse on defense, but the offense is kind of trekking the other way because of injuries, and Daniel Jones is their quarterback. although he's probably better than Taylor Heineke. But anyways, their plan has not been as they're injured on the O-line, they're injured at receiver. It's tough for them because they don't have the personnel, whereas Washington has a little bit of it. So, I think this is the best division in football. I think every game that's played between these teams going forward is must-watch television, quite frankly. Even when it's, in my opinion, the best versus the worst team in this division, the Bills versus the Patriots, I would not count on any one of these games just because I think they're highly competitive being division games. They're very important for the playoff race. And the way that teams have won games this year where offense is kind of taking a back seat for the first time in a while, we're seeing these kind of, again, grindy football games that run the ball, turnovers matter more than they have in years because there's just not enough explosive offensive plays to overcome them. You're going to have more upsets. You're going to have more games won by the team who's just willing to run out the clock. And that gives teams like the Patriots and the Jets a better chance this year than they would in normal seasons.
Well, it's going to be really interesting when it comes down to the wire because I think that tiebreakers may come into play here. I mean, with the Bills and Dolphins currently tied for the division lead, the Jets are only one game back. The Patriots are only one game back behind that. Patriots have the outright tiebreaker over the Jets after beating them twice. The Jets have the tiebreaker over over the Dolphins and the Bills currently with one game left yet to play between each of them. And so the Dolphins also have to play the Bills again. So, I mean, whoever wins these games against each other as the season closes out is probably going to determine a division winner. And I know that some people, might not take the Jets seriously as a division winner here, but I think that they absolutely should because, again, Terran Armstead is out. I believe it was 2 to 3 weeks was what Kyron said earlier this week. Well, they have to play the 49ers. If they couldn't freaking block Jerry Hughes at this point, how are they going to block Nick Bosa with Brandon Shell at left tackle? Like that, I'm not saying they can't win the game, but do not be shocked at all if that game gets kind of ugly on the offense because they have the DBs to back it up too. I mean, Hufanga's playing incredibly well. I think Travarius Ward, he might be hurt right now, but he also might be healthy. I don't remember at this moment, but
it's a good defense.
That's a great defense, and the Dolphins could absolutely drop a game to that.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at that, then the Patriots are playing the Bills are playing the Patriots this week. So if the Bills win, then they are sole leaders in the division, assuming the Dolphins lose. If the Bills lose this game and the Jets beat the Vikings, which again is probably viable because even though they are a better team than the Bears, they're also defensively weak in exactly where Mike White can hurt you, I think. And that is different probably for the rest of the year, depending on the team. But at least in this game, it's a good matchup for them. So if the Bills lose this game, then the Jets are in sole lead for the division, depending on how if the Dolphins and Bills both lose. So it's like this is all pretty tight right now. And if you have Terran Armstead out for multiple weeks, assuming he gets healthy at the right time, they're probably still in the playoffs and whatnot, but they might lose their grip on the division. So it's really, really tight. And is it conceivable that the Patriots somehow come out of this winning the division again?
I think it is. I think every team is. I think everyone's in the same race. The Dolphins are interesting because I think the way they've been trending, like I kind of liked them as the team to kind of end up winning eventually, but the Armstead injury just changes it because I, quite frankly, would have picked them to beat the Niners this week. If Mike McDaniel schemes a way for them to beat them the way they looked without Armstead against that defense in San Francisco, give him coach of the year right now because I don't know how he's going to do it because they already had issues in the offensive line and we're scheming around it anyways, just moving the quarterback on every play, doing these RPO moves where they roll the quarterback after a fake handoff and have him throw on the run. It's just, and that doesn't even work when you don't have the tackle support because you're not going to roll to the tackle side and have him get blown up and expect to make a throw over and over again with pressure in your face. So I don't know what they're going to do. It'll be interesting. Yeah. They might run the ball more,
but I mean at the same time, they've got Dre Greenlaw, they've got Fred Warner and Hufanga and
Yeah,
I guess Ward is
all
their
over the
other starter.
place.
Like they're loaded. This is not where like you just have to get past the D line and you're solid. Like these are all players who will make TFLs or who will pick the ball off. I
Yeah,
mean, this is probably not a defense where Tua can be rolling to his left, throw the ball back right. You know what I mean, and expect to complete the ball. Like it's very impressive when he does it, but I'm not sure that's the kind of play you should be trying to make against this defense because they'll bait you and they'll get you. So I'm not trying to say that the Dolphins will absolutely lose, but it's definitely going to be a majorly uphill battle with those trench matchups. So what about we know who the Bills are. They live and die by Josh Allen. However well he and Stephon Diggs play will pretty much dictate how the game goes until they get up against, maybe the Bengals or the Chiefs where they can just go toe-to-toe in a shootout, right? So as long as they play well, they can ultimately win the division just because Josh Allen's that good. The Dolphins, we know, is probably going to largely depend on the health of the offensive line because their skilled players are incredible. And as long as he's got enough time to get the ball off, then that will probably be a successful offense. Patriots have been just doing this forever and a day, so we know what their pathway to success is. Control the ball on defense, control the ball on offense, and keep the score relatively low. The question here is the Jets. What is their upside with Mike White? Because if you watch him play, I didn't do a full film breakdown for him this game, but last year when he went off, it was basically 0 7-step drops. Everything was quick game or 5-step. He can get the ball accurately and quickly where it needs to go, but tight window throws are tough for him, and especially he's not going to be hitting like hole shots. He doesn't have that kind of deep touch. It's really more driving throws that he's good at, and so there are going to be defenses that are able to lock that down. Do you think that the Jets' offensive situation is good enough that won't matter, that they'll always be able to find a way to get the guys the ball? And do you think that this is the beginning of a streak, or do you think this is a one-off? I mean, what do you think about Mike White? Because when they get to the playoffs, it'll be tough. But, I mean, until we get there, what do you think?
I think he's an upgrade for sure right now. And I wasn't overly impressed with how he played against Chicago. To me, you've built the 49ers. Like, I think if he continues to play the way he did, he's Jimmy Garoppolo. Like, and then you know what? This year that might be enough to go very far, because I think a lot of teams are struggling to have consistency in offense, and having a guy who just makes the correct throws on 1-step drops and just, can drive the ball into, two open receivers is important accurately. Again, like, we need to see more play from him because you never know. I believe had like a bad game last year after, what was it? It might have been Buffalo though. So I don't even know if like really you should take much away from that because the team was much worse than the Bills at that point. But
all it was is just an example of how he cannot win you the game himself, because the Jets were drastically undermanned in that game, and the Buffalo defense was, I think, the best in the league last year, and it was ugly, but
a lot of turnovers too.
Yeah, he got to the point where he was just kind of throwing the ball up because there was nothing else he could do, and it looked ugly. But
as does Jimmy Garoppolo when he's put in that situation.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a bad game, but it also just shows you what his limitations are. Like he's not going to roll out and flick the ball down the field. Like he's just, if it's not on time, it's probably not happening. So
you got to put them in situations to find open receivers. They have the personnel. I mean, really, they do. We've talked about this. The offensive line is more decent than it's been in years, and I think their weapons are like a strength at this point, especially at receiver. I saw what Elijah Moore's capable of when he's getting the ball thrown his way. He's just going to have to do the Jimmy Garoppolo thing. If like coach says to throw it here, I'm going to do it, regardless of how aggressive that throw is. He's going to, and I think they're capable of going far as long as he does that, doesn't try to do too much, as long as they don't have mass injuries, which is always a question mark for every team. And the defense is just playing so well right now that it's a formula. It certainly is. It's early for them in terms of their curve of being like a good football team. So like, I don't know how far necessarily their ceiling is going to take them, but look, we've already seen them beat Buffalo with Zach Wilson playing quarterback. Yes, it required the Bills to make some mistakes, but again, I think this is a year where our teams are making mistakes every week. It's like a different. We're seeing this cyclical nature of the NFL going back to like we've asked too much from offenses. Now teams are starting to figure out how to turn the ball over a little more than they used to, and so that's going to be a necessary way for some teams to actually try and attack winning championships, at least for this year, maybe future years. And the Jets are just kind of one of these teams have been developed to do that right now. And I think they should fully embrace it and just see how far it takes them this year. And if it doesn't, if you get into a wild card game against the Bills and they absolutely slaughter you, all right, fine. Like you need a quarterback. Like they're not in a bad position to like try and figure that out considering the roster. But I think there's a chance that's not what happens. And I think there's a chance that this team can continue to kind of be that 49ers like, run the ball, play action, just be smart play calling on offense, and then just let the defense make the game-defining plays.
I think the thing to take away from the Bears game is, yes, it looked like easy, and he looked very good against them, and they're remarkably banged up and under-talented as it is. The positive you can take away is that there was only one actual bad decision that I remember that I could pick out, like one play where he threw the ball to the wrong place, and so if you're going to be that consistent and you do have the guys to continue making plays, you probably have a relatively high floor, and I guess that's all that you can really ask for this year. So we'll see. So I'm going to take the Bills also to win this game. Josh Allen's up and down nature makes me a little bit nervous, to be perfectly honest, but I think that the Bills are a better team than the Vikings, even if they did drop that game straight up against them. And I think if the Vikings were able to beat the Patriots, the Bills should certainly be able to do it as well. So I'll take them 3.5. And that'll do it for us today. So a long show, which I enjoyed, talking about GMs, talking about the AFC East a little bit. Appreciate Julius coming on for the news. Want to shout out Noah Ashley, our producer at No Ashtray Sports on Twitter, helping us out as always. Nick, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you? And
you can find me at Nick with Sports on Twitter, and you can also follow Sports Info Solutions there as well, as we're producing content throughout the year. Draft should get started soon with a draft page as well. Spin out some scouting reports. We have a specific process for that. Don't know how soon that's getting started, but it's exciting. They've got all sorts of content, and you can find me here on Thursdays because we're continuing to make stuff, and hopefully I can get a little more involved with stuff we're doing here because I might have a little more free time here in a little bit.
Okay. Well, next week I would love to take an early look at the top 10. We kind of did that briefly earlier this season, but it looks like who is going to be picking in the top 10 is rounding into shape. Where they're picking specifically, probably up for debate, but we know who they are at this point, and we know what kind of players they'll be looking for. So we'll talk about that. I think that's a great conversation for our Thursday show. Maybe talk a little bit about who they might target in free agency as well. You can find me on Twitter at TheMaxDean, and we will be back on Sunday before the NFL action to pick all of the games against the spread. So until then.
This podcast is brought to you by Gridiron Heroics Media.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.